Hey there, tonight we're uncovering the serene yet haunting reality of Christmas in the trenches in 1914. What you're about to discover is a fleeting moment of peace amidst the chaos of war, where enemies became friends under the glow of a shared holiday. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyes flutter open to a world that feels relentlessly grey, as if the sun itself has given up on trying to penetrate the gloom above the Western Front. Welcome to December 25, 1914. You're in the trenches, where the festive spirit is more rumour than reality, and the mud is the only thing that's in abundance. Around you, the landscape is a monotonous churn of earth and misery, a place where the word home feels like a distant whisper. You're probably wondering how you ended up here. Well, the Western Front stretches like a scar across Europe, from the North Sea down to the Swiss border. It's the line where the German forces are dug in on one side, and the Allied troops, including you and your mates, are entrenched on the other. This is trench warfare, where strategy involves outlasting the other side in a game of endurance played out in the most miserable of conditions. The trenches are your home, and they're nothing like the postcard-perfect images of war you might have imagined. They're more like the set of a horror film, complete with mud, rats, and the constant threat of enemy fire. Your morning routine kicks off with a cold slap of reality, literally. The air is as biting as a jilted lover, and the chill has seeped into every layer of your uniform. You pull on your boots, praying that today isn't the day you fall victim to the infamous trench foot. Nothing like the prospect of your feet rotting away to set the tone for the day. The trenches are a breeding ground for such afflictions, partly due to the stagnant water that collects at the bottom. It's a breeding ground for misery, too, as you and your fellow soldiers shuffle through the morning mud, grasping for some semblance of normality. Let's talk numbers, because nothing says festive cheer like cold, hard statistics. The trenches on the Western Front are roughly 475 miles long. That's about the distance from New York City to Montreal, but there's nothing cosmopolitan about your surroundings. You're part of a massive chess game, where the pawns are human lives, and the board is a quagmire of mud and despair. The trenches are about 7 feet deep and 6 feet wide, just enough space for a man to stand up straight without exposing himself to the snipers on the other side. You feel like a mole, burrowed into the earth, with only the occasional periscope glance upward to remind you there's a sky above. Breakfast is a meagre affair, perhaps a piece of stale bread or a tin of bully beef if you're lucky. The supply lines are stretched thin, so you make do with what you have, which is not much. The food is as uninspiring as the scenery, but at least it's something to chew on while you contemplate the absurdity of it all. Irony isn't lost on you that today is Christmas Day, a time for feasting and celebration back home. Here, it's just another day of survival, another day to keep your head down and your spirits up. Now, let's debunk a few myths. The Christmas truce of 1914, where soldiers from both sides famously laid down their arms to celebrate the holiday, did happen. But it wasn't some grand, universal ceasefire where everyone sang carols and played football. It was more of a spontaneous series of unofficial truces, a patchwork of peace in a landscape dominated by war. The reality is, most soldiers spent Christmas in the same way they spent every other day, trying to stay alive, trying to stay warm, and trying to keep a sense of humor about it all. But how do you cope with it? How do you find a way to endure the unendurable? For many, it's through camaraderie. The trenches are a melting pot of backgrounds and accents, where soldiers from all walks of life are thrown together in the crucible of conflict. You share stories, jokes, and sometimes even a song to keep the darkness at bay. The absurdity of the situation demands laughter, if only to stave off the tears. The threat of enemy fire is ever present, a constant hum in the background that you learn to live with, like a bad song stuck on repeat. Yet, despite the danger, there's a strange sort of routine to it all. You clean your rifle, check your gear, and stand to attention at dawn and dusk, the traditional times for an enemy attack. It's a ritual, a way to impose some order on the chaos that surrounds you. And then there's the weather, unforgiving and relentless. The mud is thick and cloying, sucking at your boots with every step. It's a wonder anyone can move at all. The cold wind slices through your uniform like a knife, and the rain, when it comes, is a relentless downpour that turns the trenches into a network of rivers. You find ways to cope, perhaps by wrapping your feet in rags or huddling close to your fellow soldiers for warmth. It's not much, but it's enough to get by. As the day wears on, you can't help but think of home. You wonder what your family is doing right now, whether they're sitting down to a Christmas dinner or opening presents around the tree. It's a world away from the mud and the blood, a world that feels more like a dream than a reality. You hold onto that thought, that image of warmth and light, as you trudge through the day. By now, you're probably thinking that life in the trenches is the ultimate test of endurance, and you'd be right. It's a place where the human spirit is pushed to its limits, where every day is a battle not just against the enemy, but against the elements and the exhaustion that gnaws at your bones. Yet somehow, you find a way to keep going. You dig deep, both literally and metaphorically, and you find reserves of strength you never knew you had. The day drags on, the hours merging into each other in a blur of monotony and mud. You share a cigarette with the soldier next to you, the smoke curling up into the grey sky, a brief moment of respite in the midst of it all. It's a small comfort, but in a place like this, small comforts are worth their weight in gold. As evening approaches, you know that soon it will be time to hunker down for the night. But for now, you focus on getting through the next hour, the next minute. You keep your head down, your spirit up, and your sense of humor intact. After all, if you can't laugh at the absurdity of it all, what can you do? And so, here you are, Christmas Day in the trenches of 1914. It's not the holiday you imagined, but it's the one you've got. You make the best of it, finding moments of light in the darkness, moments of laughter amidst the madness. Because here, in the mud and the misery, that's what keeps you going. Yet, as the morning wears on, you find yourself pondering the unromantic nuts and bolts that keep this whole grim spectacle running. Because even a war needs its accountants. Let's face it, if war were a Broadway show, the trenches would be where all the drama unfolds, but the real action, the logistical magic, happens backstage. Imagine the mind-boggling logistics of keeping nearly 3 million soldiers supplied across this 475-mile stretch of chaos. The sheer scale is dizzying, like trying to feed a small nation 3 times a day, every day without fail. Think of the staggering costs. Britain's war efforts alone were burning through around £3, 85 million per day by 1960. The budget was skyrocketing faster than a middle school crush. But hey, someone had to keep the mud flowing and the bullets flying. It wasn't just about sending men to the front lines. It was about ensuring they had boots, rifles, and those charming steel helmets that were all the rage. The true miracle, keeping those supply lines open through the chaos of war-torn Europe, like threading a needle while riding a bucking bronco. The supply chains stretched across Europe like a vast, invisible web, with depots and factories working overtime to churn out everything from ammunition to socks. Trains, trucks and horses all were pressed into service to deliver much-needed supplies to the front. Picture this, an army of quartermasters, the unsung heroes of the war, working tirelessly to ensure that every soldier had a, relatively, warm coat and a vaguely edible biscuit. They're the unsung heroes, the logistical wizards whose names never make the history books, but whose work was essential to keeping the war machine chugging along. Now, about that supposed glamour of being on the front lines, a myth as persistent as a bad penny. War propaganda back home painted a picture of heroism and gallantry, a narrative designed to keep morale high and recruitment numbers even higher. Posters depicted dashing young men in spotless uniforms, charging valiantly into battle, with nary a hint of mud or misery. But the reality, a far cry from those polished images. Life in the trenches was about as glamorous as a root canal, except with more mud and fewer narvacane. The truth was stark. For every soldier itching to prove his mettle, there were countless others just trying to survive the day. The trenches weren't a stage for heroics. They were a test of endurance, both physical and mental. The constant shelling, the lice, the damp, these were the real adversaries, and they didn't care about medals or glory. The glamour of trench warfare was a carefully crafted illusion, designed to mask the grim reality of life at the front. But why did these myths persist? Perhaps because they offered a palatable narrative, a way to make sense of the senseless. It was easier to swallow the idea of noble sacrifice than to confront the brutal truth that war is, at its core, a messy, chaotic business. And let's not forget, these myths served a purpose. They rallied the home front, inspired enlistment, and kept the war machine well-oiled and humming. Yet, amidst the muck and the mire, there were moments of humanity, like rare jewels glinting in the mud. The soldiers, young men from every corner of the empire, learned to adapt, to find humor in the absurd, to forge bonds that could withstand the horrors of war. You'd be amazed at how resourceful you can get when your life depends on it. Rivalries turned into camaraderie, and beneath the grime, a brotherhood was born. The cost of this war wasn't just counted in pounds or francs, but in human lives. Over 16 million souls were lost, each one a story cut short, a future unfulfilled. The human toll was staggering, a grim reminder that beneath the strategies and supply lines lay the beating heart of humanity. The war wasn't just fought by generals and politicians. It was fought by men like you, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of history. As the day marches on, you're acutely aware of the delicate balance between life and death, between order and chaos. Every decision, every movement, a potential tipping point. It's a dance with fate, a precarious waltz on the edge of oblivion. And yet, somehow, you find a way to keep going, to soldier on in the face of it all. By the time the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows over the battlefield, you find yourself reflecting on the absurdity of it all. Here you are, in the trenches of World War I, on Christmas Day no less, grappling with the weight of history. It's a place where every day is a testament to human resilience and the indomitable spirit that drives us forward, even in the darkest of times. And so, as the night settles in, you prepare once more to face the unknown. The trenches may be your home for now, but deep down, you know they won't define you. War is a crucible, a forge that shapes and molds, and you are resolved to emerge stronger, wiser, and with a story to tell. A story of courage, camaraderie, and survival against all odds. The night settles in, and as you brace yourself for another chilly evening in the trenches, let's take a moment to explore what made Christmas 1914 more than just another date in the wartime calendar. The Christmas truce of 1914. It's like the unicorn of World War I stories. Everyone's heard about it, many doubt its existence, yet the tales persist. But what was the real magic behind it? Was it a collective moment of holiday spirit, or simply a brief lapse in the relentless grind of war? Now, let's set the scene. It's midday on December 25th. The guns have gone eerily silent, like an orchestra conductor suddenly pausing mid-symphony. Across no man's land, a space usually as welcoming as a snake pit, a peculiar sound drifts over, singing. Not your battle cries or orders, but Christmas carols. Still Nat or Silent Night, if you want a soundtrack to this unexpected chapter in the war. The truce wasn't a grand, orchestrated affair. Rather, it was a spontaneous act of humanity breaking through the cracks of warfare. It started with soldiers, exhausted, mud-caked, and longing for a taste of normalcy, tentatively stepping into the open. Imagine the tension. Two sides who have spent months trying to obliterate each other, now facing off with nothing but the cold air between them. And yet, Christmas spirit proved more contagious than trench fever as men from both sides ventured out to exchange greetings, cigarettes, and even buttons from their uniforms like kids trading baseball cards. But why did it happen? Necessity, mostly. Both sides were dug in, and a temporary cessation of hostilities offered a respite from the ceaseless rain of artillery. It's worth noting that this wasn't an official ceasefire. Commanders didn't send orders down the line to break bread with the enemy. No, this was grassroots peacemaking, a testament to the human desire for connection even amidst chaos. And while it didn't happen everywhere along the front, these pockets of peace were real enough to become the stuff of legend. Here's a fun fact. During this truce, a game of football allegedly broke out between British and German troops. Talk about a match for the ages. It's a charming story, one that paints the war in softer hues, but whether it happened exactly as the legends say is anyone's guess. The truth is likely a bit less cinematic. Imagine a muddy kickabout rather than a full-on World Cup final. Still, the idea of soldiers swapping bullets for a football, even briefly, is a powerful image. First-hand accounts from the time add colour to the narrative. A British soldier, Private Frederick Heath, wrote about the surreal experience of seeing the enemy up close. Here we were laughing and chatting to men whom only a few hours before we were trying to kill. he recalled. It's moments like these that remind us of the shared humanity on both sides of the trench line, a poignant counterpoint to the relentless drumbeat of war. Yet, let's not wax too poetic here. The truce was in many ways a fluke of geography and timing. The harsh winter conditions and the familiarity of the holiday season created a unique melting pot for this impromptu peace. The soldiers on both sides were, after all, far from home, grappling with the harsh realities of trench life and yearning for a connection to the world beyond the mud and wire. But what did this mean for the soldiers? In truth, it was a fleeting respite, a brief pause in the nightmare. It offered a chance to bury the dead without fear of being shot, to swap stories and small gifts, and to remember, if only for a moment, the world beyond the war. While the truce was short-lived, its legacy endured. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity can shine through. Yet, like all good stories, this one was shaped by those who told it. The media of the day played its part in embellishing the event, crafting a narrative that was more palatable for those back home. Newspapers seized on the tale, spinning it into a yarn of brotherhood and goodwill. It sold papers, sure, but it also served a deeper purpose. In a war marked by unprecedented slaughter, the Christmas truce became a beacon of light, a reminder that even amidst the horror, there was room for hope. The truce may have been romanticized in hindsight, but its impact was real enough. It offered a sliver of humanity in an inhuman world, a moment where the lines blurred, and enemies could see each other as men, not just targets. And maybe, just maybe, it planted the seeds for future peace, however distant that peace would be. So, as you stand there in the chill of the trenches, reflecting on this extraordinary event, you realize that even amidst the mud and misery, there's a glimmer of something more. A reminder that the human spirit, when given the chance, can rise above even the most daunting of circumstances. And while this truce wouldn't bring an end to the war, it offered a glimpse of what could be, a world where conflict gives way to understanding, if only for a day. As the afternoon wears on, and the unofficial ceasefire slowly dissipates into the bitter evening, the realities of war creep back in. The truce was never meant to last. It was merely a pause button in a symphony of chaos. The officers, many of whom turned a blind eye to the fraternization, began reasserting control. Orders were orders, after all, and the war had to resume its grim business. The soldiers returned to their trenches, taking with them memories of a day that defied the brutal logic of war. A day when, for a brief moment, they were not just soldiers, but human beings. But as the guns began to roar once more, the lessons of that day lingered. The Christmas truce of 1914 was a fleeting reminder of the potential for peace, a symbol of the enduring power of humanity, even in the darkest times. And so, as the sun set on that unusual Christmas day, the soldiers hunkered down, knowing that tomorrow would bring a return to the familiar rhythms of war. Yet, in their hearts, they carried the memory of a day when enemies became friends, if only for a moment. It's a story that continues to resonate, a testament to the enduring power of hope and the unyielding spirit of those who dare to dream of a better world. As the soldiers tucked those fleeting memories of the Christmas truce into their hearts, they also reached for their pens, the humble tools of connection to a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away. Letters home were the lifelines, the threads that tied these young men to the lives they'd left behind. Imagine the scene. A soldier hunched over a scrap of paper, the flickering light of a candle his only companion, as he tries to capture the chaos and camaraderie of trench life in a few short paragraphs. It was part confession, part therapy, and at times a desperate plea for normalcy. These letters were the Instagram posts of their day, snapshots of life at the front, sent with hopes of reassurance. "I'm fine, don't worry," they'd write, even if the truth was a muddy, lice-ridden mess that made fine look like a far-off dream. Take one Private Albert Morn of the 2nd Queen's Regiment, for example. He wrote about the Christmas truce in his letter, saying, "It was a day of peace in war. It is only a pity that it was not a decisive peace." Such words were both a comfort and a reminder of the stark realities they faced. The psychological impact of war is a beast of its own. The trenches weren't just muddy ditches. They were pressure cookers for the mind. The repetitive routines, coupled with the ever-present threat of death, created a mental strain that only those who lived it could truly understand. Diaries from the time offer a window into this world, revealing the deep yearning for normalcy. Soldiers like Lieutenant Geoffrey Harold Maylands articulated the longing for the mundane, writing, "I wish to God I was back home, even with all its little troubles." It's a sentiment as old as war itself. The desire to escape the insanity and return to a world where the biggest worry is a leaky roof or a broken fence. Morale was the currency of survival. When the going got tough, and let's be real, it was always tough, the soldiers turned to small comforts to keep their spirits from sinking like stones in the mud. A shared joke, a smuggled bottle of rum, or even a well-worn deck of cards could be enough to stave off despair. It's the little things that kept the wheels turning, like the camaraderie of a close-knit unit or the rare luxury of a heart meal. One soldier described a meal of heart stew and a tart of rum as if he'd been served a 5-course feast at the Ritz. The British Army, ever pragmatic, recognized the importance of morale and did what it could to maintain it. Enter the Princess Merry Christmas Fund, a brainchild of the young royal, sought to provide a little slice of comfort to the troops. Each soldier received a brass box filled with cigarettes, tobacco, a Christmas card, and a photo of the princess herself. For many, it was a tangible reminder that they hadn't been forgotten, that someone back home cared enough to send a piece of normalcy their way. And let's not forget the power of music. Just as carols drifted over no man's land during the truce, soldiers often turned to song to lift their spirits. There was something about belting out a tune that could cut through the gloom like a knife through butter. "It's a Long Way to Tipperary" became an anthem of sorts, a jaunty reminder of home and hearth, even if Tipperary was more a state of mind than an actual destination. Now, let's take a moment to poke holes in the romanticized notion that every soldier was a stoic hero, bravely facing the horrors of war without a flicker of fear. Truth was far muddier, literally and figuratively. Fear was a constant companion, and anyone who says otherwise is selling something. But amidst the fear, there was a resilience that defied the bleakness. It wasn't about never feeling afraid. It was about finding the strength to keep going despite it. The letters and diaries that survived the war paint a picture of men grappling with their own humanity. They wrote of the sights and sounds that haunted their dreams, the friendships that buoyed them, and the absurdity of a world turned upside down. In the trenches, time was a fluid concept, bending and stretching in ways that defied logic. Days felt like years, and yet weeks slipped by in the blink of an eye. The economic backdrop to all this was a ticking clock. War is an expensive business, and by 1914, the cost was climbing faster than a cat up a tree. The British government had to get creative, introducing war bonds and increasing taxes to fund the effort. The economy was a machine that needed constant feeding, and it was the soldiers in the trenches who paid the highest price, both economically and personally. As evening descended on those muddy trenches, the soldiers huddled together for warmth, the glow of a shared cigarette illuminating their weary faces. Each puff of smoke was a reminder of home, of the lives they'd pressed pause on, and of the world they hoped to return to. It was a strange kind of brotherhood, forged in the fires of conflict, where the bonds of friendship became as essential as the air they breathed. Yet, despite the camaraderie, the yearning for home never faded. It was a constant ache, a dull throb that colored every moment. For many soldiers, the letters they received from home were lifelines, as vital as food and water. They were glimpses into a world untouched by the horrors of war, where life carried on with its familiar rhythms. A letter might contain news of a new baby, a wedding, or simply a recounting of the mundane events that make up a life. These snippets of normalcy were treasures beyond measure, a reminder that there was a world worth fighting for. And so, as the sky darkened and the chill of night settled over the trenches, the soldiers prepared to face another evening in the crucible of war. The sounds of laughter and song echoed faintly through the night, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In their hearts, they carried the hope that someday soon they'd lay down their rifles for good and return to the lives they'd left behind. The Christmas truce of 1914 may have been a fleeting moment of peace, but it left an indelible mark on those who lived it. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is light to be found, a glimmer of hope that can sustain the weary soul. And as the soldiers settled into their makeshift beds, the memories of that extraordinary day lingered, whispering of a future where peace might one day prevail. As the night wore on, the soldiers clung to their small comforts, finding solace in the familiar rituals of trench life. The crackle of a fire, the warmth of a shared blanket, and the gentle murmur of conversation, these were the things that kept the darkness at bay. In the midst of war, they found ways to endure, to hold onto their humanity in a world gone mad. And so, as the clock ticked steadily towards midnight, the soldiers of 1914 faced another night in the trenches with a mixture of dread and determination. The war would continue, as relentless as ever, but for now they took comfort in the knowledge that they were not alone. They had each other, and that, in the end, made all the difference. As you lay back in the damp confines of the trench, the exhaustion settling into your bones, you can't help but reflect on the day's events. The fleeting peace of the Christmas truce was like finding a single flower blooming in a wasteland, unexpected, beautiful, and all too brief. But let's be real. This wasn't a fairy tale moment that altered the course of history. It was a blip, a temporary lapse in the grim business of war. Yet it planted the seeds for a broader understanding that would eventually shape the landscape of post-war Europe. Now, let's zoom out a bit. The First World War, aka the war to end all wars. Spoiler, it didn't. Was a seismic event that reshaped the entire globe. It was a 4-year slog of industrialized warfare, a grim showcase of humanity's capacity for destruction. But it was also a catalyst for change, the crucible in which modern Europe was forged. The trenches, with their mud and misery, were the front-row seats to this transformation. Experiences of soldiers on the front lines were microcosms of the larger shifts happening in society. Take the notion of class, for instance. Before the war, European society was like a neatly arranged tea set. Everyone had their place, from the fine china of the upper class to the chipped mugs of the working folk. But in the trenches, that all went out of the window. Rank might have divided officers from enlisted men, but the mud was a great equalizer. In the belly of the beast, a duke and a dock worker shared the same rations, the same fears, and the same lice. War has a way of leveling the playing field, albeit in the most brutal of ways. This democratization of dirt and danger had lasting effects. After the war, the old social hierarchies would find themselves shaken to their core. The soldiers returning home were no longer content to accept the status quo. They'd seen a different world, a world where your worth wasn't measured by your birth, but by your courage, your resilience, and your ability to keep a sense of humor when everything else was falling apart. Let's talk economics, because nothing says, let's change the world, like a good fiscal crisis. The war bled the coffers of Europe dry, racking up a tab that made previous conflicts look like a kid's lemonade stand. Britain alone was left owing over £850 million by the end of the war. And what happens when the money runs out? You get creative, or you go broke trying. This financial strain forced nations to rethink their economic priorities. The old empires began to crumble, their colonies slipping through their fingers like sand. New political ideologies, like socialism and communism, found fertile ground in the economic chaos, promising a new order to replace the one shattered by war. But let's not get too bogged down in the doom and gloom. Amidst the rubble, there was also hope. The League of Nations, the precursor to today's United Nations, emerged from the ashes of the war, an ambitious attempt to ensure that such a catastrophe would never happen again. It was like trying to patch a sinking ship with duct tape, but it was a start, a symbol of a world that dared to dream of peace. And then there's the Christmas truce itself. Its legacy isn't one of tactical brilliance or strategic importance, but of humanity's enduring capacity for empathy. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's a flicker of light, a whisper of hope. It's a story that's been told and retold, gaining a mythic quality over the years. But beneath the romance lies a simple truth. People are people, no matter which side of no man's land they are on. Now, let's debunk a few myths because, let's face it, history loves a good yarn. The Christmas truce wasn't some grand, coordinated peace effort. It was messy, impromptu, and limited in scope. Not every soldier laid down his arms, and the truces varied from sector to sector. But the myth persists, because it taps into something deeply human, a longing for connection, a desire for moments of grace amidst the chaos. As the night deepens and the cold seeps into your bones, you realize that the war may have been a crucible of suffering, but it also forged new pathways for progress. It was a painful birth of modernity, a reminder that even in destruction, there's the potential for renewal. The soldiers who fought and died in those trenches may not have changed the world with their Christmas truce, but they left behind a legacy of resilience, of courage, and of hope. So, as you lay there, listening to the distant rumble of artillery, you find solace in the knowledge that the story doesn't end here. The war would continue, but so would the dream of peace. The experiences of 1914 would echo through history, shaping the world in ways those soldiers could scarcely imagine. They may have been pawns in a game far larger than themselves, but their stories, their sacrifices, and their humanity would endure. And there you have it, the day in the life of a soldier on Christmas Day 1914, a snapshot of a world at war, yet yearning for peace. It's a story that reminds us of the power of human connection, even amidst the most dire circumstances. As you drift off to sleep, remember that history isn't just a series of dates and events. It's a tapestry woven from the threads of countless lives, each one a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity. Vikings and their flaming ship funerals. It's an image so ingrained in pop culture, you'd think every Norse warrior went out like a pyrotechnic rock star. But here's the kicker. The whole Viking funeral pyre on the sea thing is about as common as a unicorn at a horse race. The truth is, most Vikings didn't get a Hollywood-worthy flame show. In fact, the average Viking send-off was far more down-to-earth, and sometimes downright pragmatic. Let's get cozy with reality here. First, a quick dose of history. The Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 AD, was a time of exploration, trading, and yes, some pillaging. But when it came to saying goodbye to the dead, the Vikings had a far more nuanced approach than just setting boats ablaze. The whole ship burial thing, when it did happen, was reserved for the creme de la creme of Viking society. We're talking about the top 1%, chieftains, kings, and those who had a serious stash of wealth. And it wasn't just about the drama of a burning vessel, it was a logistical nightmare. Building a ship was no cheap affair. It took months of labor and resources, oak and pine wood, iron nails, and skilled craftsmen. Imagine sinking the equivalent of a luxury yacht today just to send someone off to Valhalla. Not exactly the kind of budget your average Viking farmer could swing. Think about it this way. A standard Viking longship could be around 75 feet long, with room for up to 60 men. That's a lot of timber and manpower, and a burning ship would be a colossal waste of resources. Plus, you need the right weather conditions for such a spectacle. Nobody wants their dearly departed to drift back to shore because of a fickle wind. If a ship was used for burial, it was typically hauled onto land and buried under a mound, like a giant earthy blanket. They were then filled with grave goods, items believed to be useful in the afterlife. These could range from weapons to jewelry, and even horses or slaves. Yeah, the Vikings didn't exactly do minimalism. Now, if you weren't a member of the Viking elite, your funeral would look a lot less like an action movie and more like a community potluck. Most Vikings were buried in the ground, sometimes cremated, with their ashes placed in an urn. The funeral rites often depended on the dead's social status and the local customs. In some cases, they would build a cairn, a pile of stones over the body. It was like a personalized gravestone, only, with rocks instead of marble. Funerals were a big deal in Viking society, not just for the dead, but for the living. They were a chance for the community to come together, share stories, and perhaps, more importantly, show off a bit. It was as much about reinforcing social hierarchy as it was about honoring the deceased. You wanted your neighbors to see that you could throw a proper send-off, complete with feasting, drinking, and possibly a little friendly competition. Think of it as a medieval PR event, one last chance to cement your legacy and ensure your name lived on in the sagas. But let's not get too caught up in the romance of it all. These rituals also served practical purposes. For one, they helped to manage grief and provide closure. They reinforced the bonds within the community and reminded everyone of their place in the social order. In a society where loyalty and reputation were everything, these rites were as much about the living as they were about the dead. So why the flaming ship myth? Blame it on dramatic flair and a bit of misunderstanding. Arab traveller Ahmed ibn Fadlan's 10th century account of a Viking funeral along the Volga River painted a vivid picture of a chieftain's send-off, complete with a ship, a slave girl sacrificed to join him in the afterlife, and a fiery conclusion. It was a spectacle that captured the imagination and has been retold and embellished ever since. But remember, Ibn Fadlan was chronicling the exception, not the rule. Viking funerals, like any cultural ritual, were diverse and adapted to the circumstances of time, place, and social status. Economic realities often dictated that practical solutions triumphed over grand gestures. After all, not every Viking could afford to go out in a blaze of glory. For most, it was more about going gently into the good night, with a little help from their friends, and maybe a horn of mead, just for good measure. And speaking of mead, let's toast to the Norse gods who played a starring role in this Viking funeral saga. You see, Norse mythology wasn't just a collection of bedtime stories. It was the framework that shaped Viking life, death, and everything in between. At the heart of Viking beliefs were two key destinations for the afterlife: Valhalla, the warrior's paradise, and Hell, the more low-key eternal resting place. And spoiler alert, not every Viking was VIP enough to land in Valhalla. Let's start with the big one, Valhalla. Imagine a never-ending warrior's banquet, complete with mead flowing like water and Odin himself as your host. But getting an invite to this exclusive afterlife wasn't as simple as dying in battle. You had to be a true warrior, brave and fierce, with the kind of reputation that would make even the guards take notice. It's like the ultimate Viking Hall of Fame, and only the best of the best got in. Sure, the allure of Valhalla captured the imagination, but it was as much about reinforcing the ideals of bravery and loyalty among the living as it was about promising an afterlife. The Vikings were constantly reminded of the rewards awaiting them if they lived and died by the sword. On the flip side, we have Hel, ruled by the goddess of the same name, who was Loki's daughter, for those keeping track of the Norse family tree. Hel wasn't as grim as it sounds, but it wasn't exactly a party either. It was more like a place for everyone who didn't die in battle. Think farmers, traders, and those who met less glamorous ends. For the average Viking, Hell was less a punishment and more of a catch-all afterlife. It was the spiritual equivalent of a you-tried participation trophy. But here's the kicker. The fear of Hell wasn't so much about the place itself, but about what it represented. Failing to reach Valhalla meant you hadn't lived up to the community's warrior ideals, so the pressure to perform was real. Now, these beliefs didn't just float around in the Viking psyche. They seeped into their funeral practices. The way a Viking was sent off was often a reflection of their perceived destination in the afterlife. If you were Valhalla-bound, expect a bit of pomp and circumstance. Your send-off might include the best grave goods, from weapons to fine jewelry, all meant to prepare you for the eternal feast. But if Hell was your likely afterlife address, your funeral might be a bit more low-key, though no less important for maintaining social order. But let's not paint this with too romantic a brush. Viking funeral practices weren't just spiritual affairs. They were also a chance to flex some serious social muscle. A grand send-off could signal wealth and power, reinforcing the deceased's status, and by extension, the prestige of their family. Picture this, a funeral as an ancient PR campaign, complete with feasting, drinking, and tales of valor. It was a chance for the living to make a statement, solidifying alliances and showcasing their place in the social hierarchy. In a world where reputation was currency, a top-notch funeral was like flashing a platinum card in the afterlife stakes. And if you're wondering about the economic side of things, these beliefs had their price. Grave goods weren't just symbolic. They represented real wealth and resources. Burying a sword with its owner meant one less weapon for the living, and a ship burial, when it happened, was the Viking equivalent of burning a Ferrari. The sheer cost of these rituals meant that, for most Vikings, practicality often trumped grandeur. Funerals needed to balance honoring the dead with not bankrupting the living. After all, the Vikings were nothing if not pragmatic when it came to resource management. But let's not leave the mythos entirely. The romantic image of a Viking funeral, especially the fire-lit ship, persists because it taps into something deeply human, our need for drama and spectacle. It captures the imagination in a way that a simple burial can't. We want our heroes to go out in a blaze of glory, even if the reality was more grounded. And perhaps that's why the legend of the flaming ship endures. It gives us a story as epic as the sagas themselves, even if it was more the exception than the norm. As we sail further into Viking beliefs, it's clear that their funerals were as much about living as they were about dying. They were opportunities to express cultural values, reinforce social bonds, and maybe even inspire a bit of envy from the neighbors. But remember, for every tale of a warrior's fiery farewell, countless others went quietly into the earth, marking their passage with a cairn or a mound. It's a reminder that while the legends are grand, the reality was often humbler, and perhaps, in its own way, just as profound. And as we continue this journey, we'll see how these beliefs and practices evolved, shaped by time, place, and the ever-pragmatic Viking spirit. And speaking of profound realities, let's dig into the dirt, literally. Forget about those flaming ships for a moment, and let's get our hands dirty with some real Viking archaeology. Because if you want to separate fact from fantasy, there's no better place to start than with the evidence we've unearthed. So, grab your metaphorical shovel, and let's dig into two of the most famous Viking burial sites, the Oseberg and Garkstad ships. These aren't just any old relics. They're the creme de la Viking creme, giving us a window into the past that's as fascinating as it is complex. First up, the Oseberg ship burial, discovered in 1904 in Norway. This isn't just a boat, it's a floating palace. At 71 feet long and almost 17 feet wide, it's like the Viking version of a luxury cruise liner. But you know, without the shuffleboard. Buried around 834 AD, this ship contained the remains of two women, believed to be of high status, possibly a queen and her attendant. They were buried with a treasure trove of items, including intricately carved sledges, beds, and even a cart. Yes, a cart. Because apparently you never know when you might need to haul something in the afterlife. Moving on to the Garkstad ship, unearthed in 1880, also in Norway. If the Oseberg is the luxury liner, the Garkstad is the Viking warship. It measures a formidable 76 feet long and was built for both speed and strength. This ship housed a single male, likely a chieftain, surrounded by an arsenal of weapons, a gaming board, because who doesn't love a good afterlife board game, and 12 horses. That's right, 12. It's like a Norse Noah's Ark, but with a serious horsepower upgrade. These ship burials tell us a lot more than just who had the best digs in the Viking afterlife. They highlight the staggering resources required for such burials, resources not available to the average Viking. Think about it. The sheer amount of wood, metal, and craftsmanship involved is akin to building a multi-million-dollar yacht today. It's a stark reminder that the ships were as much status symbols as they were spiritual vessels. And here's a little reality check. Most Vikings couldn't afford to go out in such style. For them, a simple burial mound or a cairn was more realistic. But who can blame us for loving the idea of a Viking captain going out like a rock star? It taps into our love for drama and spectacle, even if it's more myth than reality. Speaking of drama, let's not forget our old friend Ahmed ibn Fadlan, the 10th century Arab traveller whose writings gave Hollywood plenty of fodder for those flaming ship scenes. His account of a Viking funeral on the Volga River is as vivid as it is controversial. According to Ibn Fadlan, the deceased chieftain was sent off on a ship with a slave girl who volunteered, mind you, to join him in the afterlife, culminating in a fiery send-off. It's a tale that's captured imaginations, but let's pump the brakes for a second. Was Ibn Fadlan a reliable witness, or was he embellishing for dramatic effect? Consider this. Ibn Fadlan was an outsider peering into a culture vastly different from his own. His account was one of the few written records of Viking customs at the time, but he was essentially the ancient equivalent of a tourist, fascinated, perhaps overwhelmed, by what he saw. His description might have been accurate for that specific event, but it was likely an exception, not the rule. The problem is, we've taken this rare instance and run with it, turning it into the de facto image of a Viking funeral. It's like assuming everyone in the Middle Ages lived in a castle, or that every Roman citizen watched gladiator matches daily. Sure, the imagery is compelling, but when we dig deeper, the reality is often more nuanced and less incendiary. So, what do these stories and sites tell us about the Vikings? For one, they were a people obsessed with status and legacy. The way you were buried was a final statement of your place in the social hierarchy. A grand send-off could immortalize your name among the living, ensuring stories of your bravery or wealth would echo through generations. But it's also a reminder that these grand gestures were limited to the elite. For the average Viking, life and death was a more modest affair. Their funerals reflected their lives, practical, community-focused, and grounded in the realities of their world. And let's not forget the economics of it all. In a society where resources were hard-won, choosing to bury wealth in the ground was a significant sacrifice. It was a balancing act between honoring the dead and preserving the living's prosperity. It's a reality check that underscores the pragmatism of Viking society, a pragmatism that often gets overshadowed by the romanticized myths we love to indulge. As we continue to explore these myths and realities, it's clear that Viking funerals were as varied as the people themselves. From ship burials that dazzled with wealth and craftsmanship to humble graves that spoke of community and kinship, every funeral tells a story. And while we might be tempted to cling to the more epic tales, it's the quieter stories that often reveal the most about who the Vikings really were. So, as we sail onward, remember that while the flames might catch your eye, it's the stories beneath the ashes that truly illuminate the Viking spirit. The Vikings' approach to funerals was less about burning boats and more about burning through social capital. These send-offs were a chance to flaunt power and wealth, ensuring the deceased left behind a legacy as grand as their final resting place. But here's where it gets interesting. Viking funerals weren't just about the dead. They were a full-on spectacle for the living, with political and economic strings attached. Let's break this down. The wealth displayed in Viking burials was like a medieval Instagram post, carefully curated to project power and status. The grave goods, those shiny weapons and glittering jewels, were more than just trinkets for the afterlife. They were symbols of the deceased's social standing. Burying a sword or a jeweled brooch was a statement. Look at what I could afford to part with. In a society where reputation was everything, a lavish funeral could elevate a family's standing or cement alliances. When the Oseberg and Garkstad ships were unearthed, the wealth they contained was staggering, like finding a buried treasure chest filled with gold doubloons. Now, let's talk numbers. A typical Viking sword could cost as much as a dozen cows, real moolah back then. Imagine sinking that into the ground, quite literally. But it wasn't just about what was buried. It was about who could afford to bury it. The elite could splash their cash on these grand gestures, reinforcing their power. But for your average Viking farmer, that was a different story. They'd be more likely to bury a well-loved axe or a modest brooch, a reflection of more down-to-earth means. And here's the kicker. These funerals weren't merely about honoring the dead. They were a strategic display of wealth redistribution. When a chieftain or a wealthy warrior was buried with their prized possessions, it wasn't just a loss to the family. Those goods were effectively taken out of circulation. But in a twist of social acrobatics, this also meant there was more room for the living to maneuver. By removing a significant chunk of wealth from the community, it reshuffled the social deck, allowing others to rise in status. This brings us to the economic implications of these funerals. The costs were astronomical. Imagine trying to bankroll a Viking funeral today. You're looking at a bill that could rival a small fortune. The resources required, wood for ships, iron for weapons, and the labor of skilled craftsmen, highlight the economic burden. This wasn't just a family affair. It was a community investment, and it's here that the impact of trade and raiding becomes crystal clear. The wealth that funded these extravagant funerals often came from trading voyages, or, let's be honest, the occasional plundering spree. Viking funerals were as much about the spoils of war as they were about spiritual journeys. Raiding, while not the noblest of professions, was a cornerstone of Viking life. It brought in the riches necessary to not only live grandly, but die grandly too. A successful raid could fill a chieftain's coffers with enough silver and gold to ensure a send-off worthy of the sagas. And let's not forget trade. The Vikings were savvy merchants, trading everything from furs to slaves across Europe and beyond. These ventures filled their ships with goods that could be transformed into social capital at home. But here's the rub. This wealth wasn't evenly distributed. Like any society, the Viking world had its haves and have-nots. The opulence of a funeral could starkly contrast with the everyday lives of most Vikings, who lived in simple wooden homes and worked the land. For the average Joe Viking, funerals were a time to come together, share what they had, and maybe envy the grandeur of those with deeper pockets. The political implications were just as significant. A grand funeral was more than just a farewell. It was a power play. By throwing an elaborate send-off, a family could demonstrate their dominance, securing their place in the social pecking order. It was a chance to flex muscles and forge alliances. Imagine inviting neighboring chieftains to a blowout funeral feast. It wasn't just about paying respects. It was about building networks, negotiating peace, or even plotting future alliances. And let's not forget the role of women in these political maneuvers. Viking women, particularly those of high status, could wield significant influence. The burial of the two women in the Oseberg ship highlights this. Their grave goods included not just jewelry and textiles, but also a ceremonial cart and sledges, suggesting they held positions of power and authority. Their funerals were a testament to their status and a strategic move to reinforce their family's political clout. In essence, Viking funerals were a theater of politics and economics, where the dead played their part in the living's ambitions. As much as these rituals were about honoring ancestors, they were also about navigating the complex web of Viking social dynamics. Every sword buried, every jewel laid to rest, was a piece of a larger puzzle, a move in the Game of Thrones that was Viking society. So, while the legend of the flaming ship may capture our imaginations, the reality was far richer and more complex. Viking funerals were a microcosm of their world, an intersection of myth, status, and strategy. And as we explore further, we'll see how these rites evolved, adapting to the shifting tides of Viking life. But for now, let's leave the ships in the harbor, the flames in our minds, and the legends to inspire future tales. There's more to this saga, and we're just getting started. And as we explore further, we'll see how these rites evolved, adapting to the shifting tides of Viking life. But for now, let's leave the ships in the harbor, the flames in our minds, and the legends to inspire future tales. There's more to this saga, and we're just getting started. Ah, the Viking funeral. It's the stuff of legends, isn't it? But let's cut through the cinematic smoke and get real. When we think of Viking funerals in today's culture, it's hard to avoid images of flaming ships and heroic send-offs. Thanks to Hollywood, these myths have sailed right into our collective consciousness. But what's the real story, and why do these myths persist like an unwanted guest at a feast? For starters, let's acknowledge the allure of the flaming ship. It's dramatic, it's fiery, and it taps into our primal love for a good send-off. Who wouldn't want to imagine their final farewell as a spectacle? But here's the thing. This idea persists not because it's factually accurate, but because it's a story that resonates. It's a tale as old as time, heroes going out in a blaze of glory. It's the kind of narrative that echoes through epic sagas, from Beowulf to Braveheart. The myth endures, because we crave stories where the ordinary transcends into the extraordinary. But let's not get carried away with the romance. The reality of Viking funerals was often as practical as it was poignant. Most Vikings were laid to rest with far less fanfare. The economics of it simply didn't allow for every warrior to have their own personal floating bonfire. Imagine the environmental impact today. Greta Thunberg would have a field day. The truth is, the burning ship was the Rolls-Royce of Viking funerals, reserved for the elite few who could afford such extravagance. The rest of the crew got a more down-to-earth farewell, complete with rocks and soil. Now, look at how these myths shape our modern view of Vikings. We picture them as fierce, larger-than-life warriors, but that's only part of the story. The Vikings were traders, farmers, and explorers too. But that doesn't sell movies, does it? So we cling to the image of the marauding raider with a flaming ship behind him. It's a compelling visual, but it glosses over the nuances of Viking society. A society that, mind you, was as much about barter and negotiation as it was about battle axes. The persistence of these myths also tells us something about human nature. We love a good yarn, especially one with a bit of fire and fury. It's the same reason why urban legends never die. They're just too entertaining to let go. And who can blame us? In a world where reality can be a bit too mundane, a touch of legend adds some much-needed spice. But there's a risk here too. When we let myths overshadow facts, we lose the chance to learn from history in all its gritty detail. So, what happens when we dig past the myths and look at the cold, hard facts? We find a Viking society that was complex, pragmatic, and far from the one-dimensional narrative we often see portrayed. Their funerals were less about spectacle and more about the social and economic realities of the time. They were a reflection of a society that valued community and continuity, even while it revered its heroes. What can we take away from this blend of fact and fiction? First, an appreciation for the Vikings' adaptability. They were masters at navigating their world, both in life and in death. Their funerals, like their lives, were a testament to their ability to balance the practical with the profound. It's a reminder that while the legends are captivating, the truth is often just as intriguing. even if it doesn't come with pyrotechnics. In the end, the legacy of Viking funerals in modern culture is a testament to the power of storytelling. These myths persist because they speak to our imagination, our desire for drama and heroism. But as we embrace these tales, let's not forget the real stories beneath the surface. The ones that tell of a people who were as strategic as they were adventurous, as grounded as they were legendary. And perhaps, in understanding this, we can appreciate not just the stories we tell, but the truths they are built upon. So, let's raise a horn of mead to the Vikings, not just the myth, but the reality. Because sometimes, the truth is every bit as epic as the legend. The rooster's crow slices through the pre-dawn quiet like a battle cry, informing you that it's time to shake off the heavy blanket of sleep. You're a knight in the 100 Years' War, and let's get this straight. Being a knight isn't all about gallivanting in shiny armor and rescuing damsels. Nope, it's a job with a steep price tag and a lot of dirt under the fingernails. Today, like any other day, begins with the clanking reality of medieval campaigning. As you rub the sleep from your eyes, the first thing you notice is the smell of old sweat and leather. Your chainmail shirt, known as a hauberk, isn't something you toss in the medieval equivalent of a washing machine. It's an investment, a life savings at 100 shillings or more, equivalent to about a skilled craftsman's annual wage. Wearing it every day makes you feel like a walking piggy bank, minus the jingle. But this isn't a fashion statement, it's your lifeline. Without it, you'd be as vulnerable as a fish in a barrel. Next, you reach for your sword. Ah, the symbol of knighthood, right? Reality check. That beauty costs around 40 shillings. If you're lucky, you've inherited one, but if not, it means a hefty chunk of your budget is tied up in keeping that blade sharp and menacing. Remember, it's not just for show. You're expected to be a master swordsman, which involves tedious hours of practice and maintenance, not exactly the glamorous life of the court. And then there's the armor, the real wallet drainer. A full suit of plate armor could set you back 200 shillings. Let's put that into perspective. It's like buying a mid-range car today. Only instead of taking you places in comfort, it turns your body into a mobile fortress. Sure, it looks impressive, but try wearing it for a day. It's more like a medieval sauna suit designed by a sadist. The romantic notion of knights shining in armor gets a little tarnished once you factor in the chafing and the constant need to polish out the rust. Now, let's talk about your trusty steed. Horses are the medieval equivalent of a sports car, and just like today, they're a bottomless pit of expenses. Your horse, probably a destrier if you're wealthy, or a rouncey if your budget's tighter, costs around £20, a staggering sum when you consider the average knight might earn just £40 a year. It's not just the upfront cost, either. Horses need feeding, stabling, and a small army of grooms. If you think your modern car service bill is painful, try managing a creature that requires its weight in hay and oats daily. The money doesn't start flowing just because you've geared up. You've got to keep everything in top shape, which means constant maintenance. Armor needs polishing, swords need sharpening, and horses need shoes. You're basically running a small business, with yourself as both CEO and janitor. Sure, there's the potential for plunder, but that's a gamble, like playing the medieval lottery, only with a much higher chance of losing your head. As the sun starts to rise, you and your fellow knights prepare to head out. There's a camaraderie here, a shared understanding that despite the costs and the hardship, you're part of something larger. You're defending your liege, your land, your family's honor. It sounds noble, but don't let the romanticism fool you. This is as much about survival and economics as it is about glory. The smell of roasting meat wafts from the campfires, reminding you of breakfast and the realities of medieval logistics. Feeding an army isn't just about keeping stomachs full, it's a strategic masterstroke. A hungry army is a mutinous army. Each knight is responsible for not just themselves, but also their retinue, squires, archers, and assorted hangers-on. It's like being the captain of a small, hungry ship, constantly navigating the choppy waters of supply lines and rations. As you mount your horse, the weight of your armor settles in, grounding you in the reality of your role. You're not just a warrior. You're a walking investment portfolio, a testament to the economic pressures of medieval warfare. The sun climbs higher, casting long shadows over the camp, and you feel the pull of history. Each day is a battle, not just against the enemy, but against the relentless grind of costs and upkeep. There's a certain satisfaction in knowing that you're part of a legacy, a chainmail link in the endless armor of history. But let's not sugarcoat it. While the bards will sing of your deeds, they'll probably skip the part about the endless financial juggling act. For now, you focus on the day ahead, the battles to be fought, and the relentless, never-ending quest to keep your head above water and attached to your neck. As you settle into your saddle, the clamor of the camp begins to fade, replaced by the rhythmic clinking of metal, a not-so-gentle reminder that your armor is as much a part of you as your own skin. And speaking of armor, let's have a heart-to-heart about this medieval fashion statement. The truth is, the armor you're wearing is less about looking like a steel-clad superhero and more about not ending up as a pincushion for enemy arrows. First off, let's talk logistics. Donning this metal wardrobe isn't something you do solo. It's a team sport requiring at least one squire, and if you're lucky, a couple of extra hands. This isn't just a matter of convenience, it's necessity. The process of suiting up is like trying to solve a medieval puzzle box, with each piece needing to fit just so. The chainmail might weigh you down by a solid 55 pounds, but it's the plate armor that really turns you into a walking tank, adding another 45 to 60 pounds. Now, you might think that once you're encased in all this metal, you'd feel invincible. But here's the kicker. Wearing armor is roughly equivalent to spending the day in a medieval sauna. There's sweat pooling in places you didn't even know could sweat. And movement, that's another story. You're not exactly bounding around like a gazelle, more like a turtle with a mortgage, slowly but surely plodding along. The armor is designed to protect, sure, but it's not infallible. The joints are weaker points, vulnerable to a well-aimed thrust. And let's not forget the helmet. It's the cherry on top of this metal sundae, weighing in at around 8 pounds. With limited visibility and your hearing muffled, it's like living inside a tin can. Romantic? Hardly, but practical. Absolutely necessary. As you join your fellow knights, the pecking order becomes clear. The knightly class might be tied together by chivalric ideals and a shared sense of purpose, but there's a hierarchy here as rigid as the armor you're wearing. The senior knights, those who can trace their lineage back to the days of William the Conqueror, have a certain gravitas. They're the ones with the best horses, the shiniest armor, the most influence. Their word carries weight, and their approval or disdain can make or break your standing. For the less pedigreed among you, the social ladder is steeper. You're constantly balancing on the tightrope of feudal obligations and personal ambition. You serve your liege lord, and in return, you might gain lands, titles, and the chance to climb a rung or two up the societal ladder. But make no mistake, it's a world where alliances are as changeable as the wind, and one misstep can send you tumbling back down. Now, let's bust a few myths about this whole chivalry business. The code of chivalry sounds like a noble calling, but in reality, it's more a guideline than a rulebook. Sure, there's the whole bit about protecting the weak and being courteous, but when push comes to sword, survival trumps all. The battlefield is no place for niceties. The real code: win at all costs. As you ready for today's march, the romanticized image of the noble knight clashes with reality. The truth is, being a knight is as much about economics and survival as it is about glory. You're a cog in the medieval war machine, bound by duty and driven by necessity. Yet there's a certain allure to it all, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the chance to carve your name into the annals of history. But don't be fooled. The songs of bards paint a rosy picture, but they conveniently skip the part where you're slogging through mud, your armor chafing at every step, your mind preoccupied with the relentless grind of maintaining your knightly status. As you march forward, you're part of a long tradition, a player in the grand chess game of medieval politics and warfare. It's not just about the battles you fight, but the battles you navigate every day to keep your place in this unforgiving world. And just like that, the sun rises on the tangled web of medieval politics, casting its harsh light on a landscape that's as much about backroom deals as it is about battlefield bravado. Welcome to the 100 Years' War, where the stakes are high, the players are ruthless, and the map of Europe is the ultimate prize in this geopolitical chess game. Let's start with why you, our gallant knight, are even here. It all kicks off in 1337, when Edward Roman III of England throws a royal-sized tantrum over the French crown, claiming it through his mother, Isabella of France. Picture this: one crown, two relatives squabbling over it like it's the last piece of cake at a family reunion. France, under Philip VI, isn't keen on sharing, and so begins a conflict that's less about glory and more like a medieval soap opera with swords. Now, as you polish your armor and prepare for another day of knightly duties, remember this isn't just a personal feud. This war is all about territory, and two key regions are harder than a blacksmith's forge: Gascony and Normandy. These aren't just random plots of land. They're the strategic linchpins of medieval Europe. Control them, and you've got a direct line to wealth, trade, and military advantage. Gascony, nestled in the southwest of France, is a jewel in the English crown. It's all about the wine trade, and who doesn't love a good Bordeaux? For England, this region is a lifeline, a rich source of revenue that keeps the wheels of war turning. But here's the kicker. While the English love the wine, the French love the land. It's this tug-of-war that keeps you and your fellow knights on a knife edge, constantly defending this vital territory. Then there's Normandy, a region that's basically the medieval version of beachfront property, if the beach were lined with castles and the occasional siege tower. For the English, Normandy isn't just land. It's a historical claim stretching back to William the Conqueror, a reminder of past glories and future ambitions. For the French, it's a personal affront, and they're not about to let it go without a fight. As you march into battle, remember that these territories are more than just lines on a map. They're the heartbeat of the war, the reason you're sweating under layers of steel and leather. They're also the reason behind the endless political machinations. Alliances are as fickle as a medieval jester, shifting faster than you can say feudal obligations. One minute you're shaking hands with a supposed ally. The next, you're crossing swords because of a betrayal that would make Machiavelli proud. Speaking of betrayals, let's not forget the role of the Burgundians. They're like the frenemies of the medieval world, switching sides with all the loyalty of a cat. In 1415, they're backing England, but by 1435, they're cozying up to the French again. If you're a knight on the ground, this political whiplash means one thing: keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. From an economic standpoint, this war isn't just fought with swords and arrows. It's fought with coins and commerce. You might think war is all about the glory, but the real victory is in the balance sheets. The English crown depends on taxing wool exports to fund their campaigns, while the French levy heavy duties on their subjects to keep their armies in the field. It's a vicious cycle of taxation and war, a medieval version of keeping up with the Joneses, only with more armor and fewer garden parties. And what about diplomacy? For all the talk of chivalry, the real game is played in the courtrooms and council chambers. Marriage alliances are the norm, with daughters traded like pawns in a high-stakes Game of Thrones. Want to secure Gascony? Marry your daughter off to a local noble. Need Normandy? Time to plan a wedding. It's as much about bloodlines as it is about battle lines, and as a knight, you're smack in the middle of these dynastic dramas. As you strap on your helmet and prepare for another day in the trenches, remember that this war isn't just about the clash of swords. It's about strategy, politics, and the relentless grind of maintaining power. While the bards will sing of your valor, they won't mention the endless negotiations, the backstabbing deals, or the economic pressures that shape every decision. In this grand tapestry of medieval politics, you're not just a knight. You're a player in a game that's as much about survival as it is about honor. You're part of a conflict that will reshape the map of Europe, setting the stage for centuries of power struggles and political intrigue. And while the romantic image of the noble knight endures, the truth is far more complex, a story of ambition, loyalty, and the never-ending quest for power. So, as you ride into the fray, remember this: the real legend of the 100 Years' War isn't just about battles won or lost. It's about the human cost, the shifting alliances, and the relentless pursuit of a dream that's as elusive as a shadow on the battlefield. Your place in history is both fleeting and enduring, a testament to the timeless dance of power and politics. As the sun sets on another day of conflict, the story of this war is far from over, with new twists and turns waiting just beyond the horizon. As the sun sets on another day of conflict, the story of this war is far from over, with new twists and turns waiting just beyond the horizon. And speaking of horizons, let's talk about the harsh realities waiting for you on the battlefield. Forget fairy-tale notions of chivalric duels and noble deeds. The 100 Years' War is a brutal cocktail of mud, blood, and sheer human endurance. When the battle horn blows, your day as a knight shifts from the mundane to the terrifyingly chaotic. Picture a cacophony of clashing steel, the ground shaking beneath the thunder of hooves, and the air thick with the acrid stench of sweat and fear. Tactics. They're less about elegant strategy and more about organized chaos. The truth is, medieval warfare is about as predictable as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. The English, your comrades in arms, favor the longbow, an iconic weapon that's as much a symbol of English martial prowess as it is a practical tool of destruction. It's said that a skilled archer can release 10 to 12 arrows per minute, each capable of piercing armor at 200 yards. The longbowmen are the rock stars of the battlefield, raining down death from a distance with a flick of their wrist. But here's the twist. While the longbow is a weapon of mass disruption, you, dear knight, are the blunt instrument of close combat. Your role involves charging into the fray, a human wrecking ball in plate armor. The cavalry charge is the medieval equivalent of a freight train, designed to smash through enemy lines with sheer force. But here's the kicker. It's not as glamorous as it sounds. The impact is bone-jarring, and if your horse goes down, you're suddenly a sitting duck in a very expensive tin can. And don't even get me started on the melee, a free-for-all where the line between friend and foe blurs faster than you can say feudal allegiance. As for the reality of combat, it's less about gallant one-on-one duels and more about survival. The battlefield is a messy, noisy place where the code of chivalry takes a backseat to the primal instinct to stay alive. Forget the Hollywood image of knights exchanging witty banter mid-duel. In the heat of battle, it's every man for himself, and the only language spoken is the clash of swords and the cries of the wounded. And then there's the toll it takes, not just physically, but psychologically. Imagine spending hours in the thick of it, your senses overwhelmed by the screams of men and the cries of dying horses. It's enough to leave even the most hardened warrior with a permanent case of the jitters. PTSD. They didn't have a name for it back then, but it's as real as the dents in your armor. Between battles, life in camp is a stark contrast. After the adrenaline fades, you're faced with the surprisingly dull routine of keeping yourself and your gear in fighting shape. Think endless hours of repairing armor, sharpening swords, and tending to your horse. It's like being stuck in a never-ending episode of medieval DIY. And let's not forget the food, or lack thereof. The medieval diet is a far cry from the royal feasts you see in movies. It's more like a never-ending medieval potluck, heavy on the bread and cheese, light on the variety. When you're lucky, there's meat, usually salted or dried to last the campaign. Fresh produce. Forget about it. You're more likely to find a unicorn than a ripe tomato in your rations. The mundane nature of camp life provides its own challenges, not the least of which is the constant threat of disease. Dysentery, typhus, and good old-fashioned plague are ever-present companions, waiting to cut down men faster than any enemy army. Sanitation. Let's just say it's not a priority. You're more likely to find knights debating the merits of different sword pommel designs than discussing latrine placement. Yet, amidst this gritty reality, there are moments of unexpected humanity. Camaraderie blooms in the shared hardship, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit finds ways to endure. Songs are sung, stories are told, and for a brief moment, the weight of war lifts, replaced by the simple joy of human connection. And wouldn't you know it, while you're there swapping tales by the campfire, the bards are busy spinning their own version of events. They craft tales of valor and heroism, stories that will be sung in halls long after the mud and blood have washed away. But here's the irony. While they immortalize your deeds in song, they skip over the mundane, the messy, the all-too-human aspects of life as a knight. So, as you lay down to sleep under a sky full of stars, remember this. The legend of the knight is as much about the cold, harsh reality as it is about the romanticized glory. It's a tale of grit, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of something greater than yourself. And as the dawn breaks over the battlefield once more, you rise with the knowledge that while history may remember the battles, it's the everyday struggles that truly define the life of a knight in the 100 Years' War. And with that, the narrative of war continues to unfold, with new challenges and triumphs waiting on the horizon. But for now, as the camp settles into uneasy slumber, the story of the knight in this grand conflict remains an ongoing saga, one where every day is a new chapter in the relentless dance of history. As the night wraps its cloak around the camp, you find yourself reflecting on the code of chivalry, that noble ideal that knights like you are supposed to live by. It's a code that promises to uphold honor, protect the weak, and serve your lord with unwavering loyalty. Sounds like the kind of thing you'd see on a motivational poster in a medieval HR office, doesn't it? But let's get real. The battlefield has a funny way of turning ideals into survival tactics. The truth is, chivalry looks a lot different in practice than it does in poetry. Sure, you're sworn to protect the innocent, but when arrows start flying, it's every knight for himself. The code of chivalry is more like the pirate's code, guidelines rather than actual rules. On paper, it's about nobility and virtue, but in reality, it's as much about pragmatism and power as it is about honor. You might be expected to spare a worthy opponent, but let's be honest, leaving a man who could kill you tomorrow isn't exactly a winning strategy. This war has reshaped knighthood, transforming it from a noble calling into a brutal necessity. And while the poets might still sing of gallant deeds, you know that the real story is about the muddy, bloody grind of medieval life. The war has turned chivalry on its head, mixing idealism with a dose of harsh reality. Knights are no longer just the glittering figures of legend. They're the grunts of a new kind of warfare, where strategy and survival trump the old codes. Think about the long-term consequences of this war. It's not just the land that's being reshaped, it's the very fabric of European society. The 100 Years' War is a game-changer, a seismic shift that's redefining nations, alliances, and the very idea of what it means to be a knight. For starters, the power dynamics are shifting. With so much focus on military campaigns, monarchs are increasingly reliant on their knights, not just as warriors, but as administrators and power brokers. It's a time when the social ladder is more like a slippery slope, and if you play your cards right, you might just climb a few rungs. Economically, the war is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's a drain on resources, with kingdoms pouring fortunes into maintaining their armies. On the other hand, it's a boon for some, especially those who profit from the chaos. Merchants dealing in weapons and armor are having a field day, while regions like Gascony are seeing their fortunes rise and fall with the tides of war. And don't forget the peasants, those poor souls caught in the crossfire. The war has led to new taxes, labor shortages, and a general sense of upheaval that will reverberate for generations. Politically, the map of Europe is being redrawn. The conflict has intensified rivalries, forged new alliances, and set the stage for future power struggles. The English and the French aren't just fighting for a crown, they're fighting for the right to shape the future of a continent. And you, as a knight, are a cog in this grand machine, your actions echoing far beyond the battlefield. Yet, despite the gritty reality, the legend of the knight endures. It's a testament to the human need for heroes, for stories that transcend the mud and blood. The bards will sing of your deeds, omitting the less glamorous details, but capturing the essence of what it means to be a knight. And maybe that's the real magic of history, the ability to transform the mundane into the mythical. As you settle in for the night, you can't help but ponder the future. What will become of knighthood when the dust finally settles? Will the knight remain a symbol of courage and chivalry, or will the realities of war overshadow the romance? One thing's for sure, the war has left an indelible mark, a legacy that will shape the stories of knights for centuries to come. So, as you drift off to sleep, remember this. You're part of a grand narrative, a story that's as much about the mud and blood as it is about honor and legend. The life of a knight in the 100 Years' War is a paradox, a blend of the romantic and the real, the noble and the necessary. And as the dawn of a new day approaches, the legacy of the knight endures, a testament to the timeless dance between history and myth. In the bustling heart of ancient Rome, where togas were less about fashion and more about status, the air was thick with the scent of ambition and olive oil. The year is somewhere in the 1st century AD, a time when the city was the epicenter of civilization, crammed with over 1 million souls, each jostling for a slice of the imperial pie. You might think of Rome as a city of marble and glory, but let's be real here. It was as much about climbing the social ladder as it was about building those aqueducts. Roman society was a well-oiled hierarchy machine, where you were more likely to feast if you knew someone who knew someone, rather than if you could whip up a mean garum sauce. At the top of this social pyramid were the patricians, the elite who traced their ancestry back to the time when Rome was little more than a collection of huts on the Palatine Hill. Think of them as the blue bloods, The old money crowd who probably didn't have to remind people of their status because their oversized villas did it for them. But Rome wasn't just about the patricians. Right below them were the plebeians, the everyday citizens who made up the backbone of the city. They were the shopkeepers, the craftsmen, and the occasional politician trying to elbow their way into the big leagues. And then, of course, there were the slaves and freedmen who did a lot of the heavy lifting, quite literally, without much hope of ever joining the ranks of the well-fed. Now, let's talk feasts, because if there was one thing Romans loved more than building roads, it was throwing a dinner party. These weren't your average potlucks. Roman feasts were the social media of the ancient world, a way to showcase wealth, curry political favor, and remind everyone just how much better your life was compared to theirs. Hosting a feast could cost a small fortune, with some of the more extravagant ones costing upwards of 100,000 sesterces. For context, that's about what a soldier earned in 16 years. So, yeah, these parties were kind of a big deal. The motivations behind these lavish gatherings were as complex as a Roman aqueduct. For the host, it was a chance to flaunt wealth and generosity. In a society where public image was everything, a successful feast could cement one's status, or at least make the neighbors jealous. But it wasn't just about showing off. Feasts were political theater, where alliances were forged over spiced wine and murmured promises, where a well-timed compliment or a thoughtful gift might secure a lucrative business deal or a favorable vote in the Senate. Yet, the feasts weren't just exclusive to the elites. Plebeians, too, hosted their own versions, albeit on a more modest scale. They might lack the exotic delicacies and imported wines, but the spirit was the same: to eat, drink, and rise a little higher in the eyes of their peers. And let's not forget the slaves, who, while typically relegated to the background, could occasionally find themselves thrust into the spotlight, bearing trays of roasted peacock and jugs of wine, hoping to catch a few crumbs of the good life. But let's not romanticize it too much. This was a world where the line between feast and famine was dangerously thin. The grain supply, crucial for feeding the city, was a constant concern. Much of it came from Egypt, shipped across the Mediterranean, and any hiccup in the supply chain could spell disaster. It's no wonder that emperors often subsidized grain to keep the masses from revolting. Bread and circuses, after all, were the twin pillars of Roman peace. So, what was the harsh reality behind these legendary feasts? For starters, while the elite dined on delicacies like dormice and stuffed hens, the average Roman's diet was far more humble. Bread, olives, and a bit of cheese were the staples for many, with meat being a rare treat reserved for special occasions. The disparity between the haves and the have-nots was as stark as the difference between a senator's villa and a crowded insula, a multi-storied apartment block where most of the city's population lived. And speaking of myths, let's puncture a few bubbles. The idea that every Roman feast was a bacchanalian orgy of excess is more Hollywood than history. Sure, there were parties that spiraled into debauchery. Think the Emperor Nero and his penchant for wild nights. But many were more subdued affairs, where philosophical debates and poetry readings were just as likely to be on the menu as honeyed figs. In the end, Roman feasts were a microcosm of the society that hosted them, a blend of opulence and practicality, ambition and tradition. They reveal a world where social dynamics played out over three-course meals, where the clink of goblets was as much about power as it was about pleasure. And as with any good party, the real story was often in the details: the whispered alliances, the subtle snubs, the strategic seating arrangements, all played out under the flickering light of oil lamps in a city that never quite slept. And so, under the flickering light of oil lamps, the Roman feast unfolded like a culinary opera, each course a new act in the drama of excess and extravagance. Forget your three-course meals. The Romans turned dining into an epic multi-act production. The menu itself was a testament to Rome's reach, a veritable United Nations of ingredients sourced from every corner of the empire. You could say Rome was the original global food market, long before the rise of trendy fusion cuisine. The first course, or gustatio, was a tantalizing teaser, often featuring eggs, olives, and fish. But let's not pretend this was your typical Sunday brunch. Oh no, the Romans had a knack for the exotic. Picture this: a platter of stuffed dormice. Yes, those are tiny rodents, rolled in honey and poppy seeds, Talk about a conversation starter. If you thought today's charcuterie boards were impressive, you haven't seen anything yet. Moving deeper into this feast of legends, the main course, or prima mensa, took center stage. Here, the Romans really flexed their culinary muscles. Roasted peacock was a favorite, its iridescent feathers often used as table decor. Because why not serve a bird that looks like it's wearing a Vegas showgirl costume? Then, there were the more adventurous dishes, like flamingo tongue and lark's tongue pie, because apparently the tongues of birds were all the rage. It was a time when the culinary mantra seemed to be the stranger, the better, while the elite toasted to their success with Falernian wine, a vintage so prized it was the ancient equivalent of a Bordeaux. Let's not forget the everyday Romans who were more likely to sip on Pascha, a humble vinegar water mix. Not exactly the stuff of Instagrammable moments, but it did the job. The contrast between the lavish and the ordinary was as stark as the difference between a senatorial robe and a plebeian's tunic. And then there was garum, the Roman condiment that could make or break a dish. This fermented fish sauce was the ketchup of its day, a staple on every table from Britannia to Syria. Think of it as the ancient world's secret weapon, a flavor balm that added a salty kick to everything it touched. But let's be real. The production process involved leaving fish guts to rot in the sun, so it was definitely an acquired taste. But let's not get carried away by the glamour and forget the economics behind these feasts. The sheer scale of such a spread was a logistical nightmare, a testament to the vast trade networks that crisscrossed the empire. Spices from India, dates from North Africa, and grains from Egypt all made their way to Rome, a city that devoured resources like a hungry lion. This intricate web of trade was the lifeline of Roman opulence, a fragile system where a single storm at sea could turn abundance into scarcity. Now, speaking of scarcity, let's debunk the myth that every Roman was living the high life. While the elite dined on delicacies, the average Roman's plate was a far cry from the extravagant spreads of the rich and powerful. The staples of bread, olive oil, and the occasional slice of cheese were more the norm. Meat was a rare treat, not just because of its cost, but because the logistics of keeping it fresh in a city without refrigeration were, how should we put it, challenging. And let's not gloss over the tales of Roman gluttony, which were as legendary as they were eye-popping. Take Lucullus, for instance, a general known more for his dining habits than his military prowess. He once threw a dinner party so lavish that it became the stuff of legend. When asked why he was dining alone with such extravagance, Lucullus reportedly quipped, "Tonight, Lucullus dines with Lucullus." Modesty clearly wasn't on the menu. Then there was the Emperor Vitellius, whose appetite was as insatiable as his ambition. His feasts were said to last from dawn till dusk, with a menu that included over 2,000 different dishes at one sitting. Pause for a moment to imagine the organizational skills, or chaos, required to pull off such an event. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well for Vitellius, who met a rather grim fate, proving that even in Rome, gluttony could be a dangerous indulgence. But for every tale of excess, there's a reminder of the everyday reality. The average Roman was more likely to know the pangs of hunger than the satisfaction of a full belly. Grain shortages were a constant threat, and bread riots were not just a plot for a Shakespearean drama, but a real danger that could topple emperors. The bread in bread and circuses was a serious matter, a lifeline that had to be maintained at all costs to keep the peace. In the end, Roman feasts were a microcosm of the empire itself, a blend of grandeur and grit, ambition and adversity. They reveal a world where social hierarchies were both reinforced and challenged over the dinner table, where the exotic was valued not just for its rarity, but for the status it conferred upon its consumer. So next time you sit down to a meal, give a nod to the Romans, whose feasts were less about sustenance and more about spectacle, a testament to the heights and depths of human indulgence. Now, let's swivel our attention to the stage where all this culinary drama unfolded, the triclinium. Forget your basic dining room. Picture a space designed with the precision of a military campaign and the flair of a theater set. The triclinium was the beating heart of any Roman feast, where the rich and powerful sprawled, not on chairs like mere mortals, but on couches arranged in a U-shape around a central table. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about status and strategy. In Roman society, where who you knew was as important as what you owned, the seating arrangement was a game of thrones all its own. The host, or dominus, would recline on the lectus medius, the central couch, which was prime real estate. It was the equivalent of sitting at the head of the table, but with a bit more horizontal flair. To his right, on the lectus summus, would be the guest of honor, someone whose presence alone could elevate the evening's prestige. Meanwhile, the lectus amuse, the couch on the left, was reserved for those with lower social standing, maybe a wealthy freedman or an ambitious plebeian hoping to curry favor. Seating was a language of its own, subtle yet screaming with significance. But this wasn't just a gathering of lounging aristocrats. Behind the scenes, the real engine of the feast was the army of slaves who kept the whole operation running smoothly. Picture a well-oiled machine of human labor, each cog trained to perfection. These were not just servers. They were the invisible hands that ensured every goblet was filled, every tray replenished, and every guest left with the impression that excess was effortless. The logistics were staggering. A feast might require dozens of slaves, each with roles as specialized as a modern restaurant's brigade de cuisine. Slaves were the unsung heroes, or perhaps, more fittingly, the voiceless workforce of these decadent evenings. Some, known as triclinarii, were tasked with overseeing the dining room, ensuring that protocol was followed and that the host's whims were promptly addressed. Others, like the ministry, delivered dishes with the grace of ballet dancers, navigating the crowded space with trays laden with exotic delicacies and goblets of wine. The most fortunate among them could earn a sliver of recognition, and perhaps even their freedom, though such stories were the exception, not the rule. And let's not forget the entertainment, because what's a feast without a little spectacle? Roman hosts spared no expense in hiring musicians, dancers, and even acrobats to delight their guests. Imagine the scene. A lyre strumming softly in the background as a poet recites verses of epic love, or a mime troupe performing a satirical skit about political life in the forum. The entertainment was as varied as the menu, a smorgasbord of sensory delights designed to keep guests enchanted and engaged. Yet, beneath this polished veneer of opulence, the darker underbelly of Roman hospitality lurked. The same system that produced such magnificence was built on the backs of those who had no choice but to serve. The irony was as thick as the garum sauce. Slaves, entertainers, and even some of the lesser guests were reminders of the rigid hierarchy that permeated Roman life. The triclinium, for all its grandeur, was a stage where power dynamics were on full display, an arena where wealth and influence were both flaunted and reinforced. The labor and spectacle of a Roman feast were as much about asserting dominance as they were about celebrating abundance. This duality was the essence of Roman society, a veneer of civility stretched thin over the harsh realities of power and privilege. It's easy to romanticize the gatherings as the height of cultural sophistication, but let's not forget the cost. The glittering facade came at the price of countless lives spent in servitude, the echoes of clinking goblets shadowed by the silent screams of those who toiled unseen. In the grand tapestry of Roman life, feasts were a brilliant thread, shimmering with the sheen of wealth yet stained by the realities of inequality. They were a testament to human ingenuity and excess, a reminder that even the most opulent of settings could not mask the complexities of human nature. As the oil lamps flickered, and the last strains of music faded into the night, the triclinium stood as a symbol of a society that thrived on spectacle and status, where every bite was a declaration of power, and every sip a nod to the fragile balance of fortune. And as the echoes of laughter and music lingered in the air, the true feast of ambition, alliances, and sometimes even animosity continued behind the scenes, long after the last guest had departed. And so, as the echoes of laughter and music lingered in the air, the triclinium stood as a symbol of a society that thrived on spectacle and status, where every bite was a declaration of power, and every sip a nod to the fragile balance of fortune. But beyond the flickering lights and fading melodies, let's dive into the real meat of the matter, how these grand feasts were less about culinary indulgence and more about political gamesmanship. Welcome to the original power lunch, Roman style. The triclinium wasn't just where you'd find the rich and famous reclining on their couches and sampling peacock tongues. It was a crucible of influence where every morsel was a maneuver, every gulp a gambit. For the Roman elite, A feast wasn't just an opportunity to flaunt your latest silk toga. It was a strategic chessboard where alliances were forged and rivalries played out over the course of several courses. Take the case of Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's wealthiest man in the late Republic. Crassus was the kind of guy who could make Jeff Bezos look like a penny pincher. He famously used his wealth to host lavish banquets, inviting senators, generals, and influential citizens, basically anyone who could help him climb the greasy pole of Roman politics. For Crassus, these feasts weren't just about stuffing faces. They were about stuffing the Senate with his supporters. And it worked. He parlayed these relationships into a political career that saw him become part of the first triumvirate alongside Pompey and Julius Caesar. Now, let's not get too carried away with the myth of the Roman feast as a purely gluttonous affair. Sure, there were enough roasted animals to make a vegetarian weep, but these gatherings were also where the real decisions were hashed out. Think of them as the ancient Roman equivalent of a G7 summit, but with more wine and less press coverage. The stakes were as high as the stacks of honey cakes served for dessert. Speaking of stakes, consider the infamous banquet hosted by Cleopatra and Mark Antony in 41 BC. This wasn't just any dinner date. It was a high-stakes diplomatic terre-à-terre. The Egyptian queen knew that winning over Antony was crucial for her survival, and what better way to do that than through a feast that could make the guards jealous. Cleopatra's strategy was clear. Wow Antony with such opulence that he'd be eating out of her hand, literally and figuratively. The result? A political alliance that would make waves across the Mediterranean, though not exactly the kind that Rome was hoping for. And let's not forget the curious tale of the Emperor Claudius, a man as underestimated as he was eccentric. Claudius had a penchant for using feasts to announce laws and policies, slipping edicts in between courses when his guests were too enraptured by the food to protest. Imagine sneaking a tax hike into dinner conversation while your companions are mid-bite into a succulent leg of lamb. His advisors probably took note to chew carefully during his banquets, lest they accidentally agree to a new decree. Now, it's easy to romanticize these gatherings as decadent soirees where politics was just an afterthought. But the truth is, Roman feasts were as calculated as they were chaotic. The seating plan alone was a masterclass in social dynamics. Who you sat next to could make or break your career. Sit next to someone like Cicero, and you might find yourself embroiled in philosophical debates about the Republic. Plop down beside someone like Julius Caesar, and you might just be plotting your next military campaign. Yes, the Romans knew that a strategic seat could lead to a strategic alliance. But let's address the elephant, or maybe the roasted elephant trunk, in the room. Were these feasts truly an egalitarian mix of political minds? Or were they exclusive cliques where only the already powerful gained more power? Spoiler alert, it was more of the latter. While these gatherings were technically open to a wide range of guests, the real movers and shakers were the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes. And let's be honest, the plebeians and lower-ranking citizens were more likely to get a seat at the table if they came bearing gifts or favors. However, the cultural ramifications of these feasts extended beyond power plays and alliances. They were also a way of reinforcing social hierarchies. The message was clear. Know your place, and maybe, just maybe, you'll get a taste of the good life. It was a society where social mobility was as slippery as the olive oil drizzled over those dormice appetizers. Sure, a freedman could attend a feast, but they'd be seated far from the host, a constant reminder of their place in the pecking order. Yet, for all the politics and posturing, there was a certain allure to the idea of a feast as a great equalizer, a place where, at least for a few hours, everyone could pretend they were part of the same club. In a world divided by class, wealth, and status, the feast was a temporary escape, a chance to indulge in the fantasy of unity, even if the reality was far more fractured. So next time you sit down to a meal, consider the layers of strategy and significance that once accompanied each dish in ancient Rome. Behind every bite of fig or sip of wine was a potential power play, a whisper of influence that could echo across the empire. And while the feasts of Rome might have been a spectacle of excess, were also a testament to the enduring human penchant for blending business with pleasure, with a side of roasted peacock, of course. As we peel back the layers of these culinary events, we uncover a society where food was never just food, but a tool of diplomacy, dominance, and sometimes disaster. As we peel back the layers of these culinary events, we uncover a society where food was never just food, but a tool of diplomacy, dominance, and sometimes disaster. But before we throw the toga in on Roman feasts as mere relics of excess, let's take a detour down the cobblestone path of history and see how these ancient dining practices echo into our modern-day dinner tables. Surprise, surprise, our contemporary culinary scene owes quite a bit to those Roman revelers. First off, consider the notion of dinner as theatre. The Roman triclinium was essentially the Broadway of its day, and if you think about it, not much has changed. Just swap out the couches for chairs and the oil lamps for mood lighting, and you've got the modern fine dining experience. The presentation of food as an art form, the carefully curated ambience, and the attentive service were all hallmarks of Roman feasting that have been reincarnated in today's upscale restaurants. While we might not be reclining on couches, the essence of a meal as a spectacle remains. Now, let's debunk the myth that our obsession with exotic and fusion cuisines is a modern invention. Romans were the original foodies, blending flavors from across their vast empire. From garum to flamingo tongues, they weren't afraid to get adventurous. So next time you're raving about your avocado, toast with a drizzle of balsamic reduction. Remember that the Romans were already remixing cuisines when Britain was still figuring out how to boil water. What's changed is not the desire for novelty, but perhaps a bit more restraint. No peacock on today's menu, thank you very much. But what about the notion of the feast as a social equalizer? Here's where the romantic image crumbles like a stale loaf of bread. Sure, today's gatherings from Thanksgiving dinners to corporate banquets often bring together people from various walks of life. Yet, just like in ancient Rome, the power dynamics and social hierarchies still subtly play out at the table. Just think about who gets seated where at a wedding or who's invited to the exclusive after-party. The unwritten rules of social status are alive and well, proving that some things never change, no matter how many centuries go by. Economically speaking, the logistics of Roman feasts mirror the complexities of today's global food supply chain. The Romans managed to import spices from India and grains from Egypt to feed their ambitions, a feat that required remarkable coordination. Fast forward to now, and our avocados have their own passport stamps, traveling from Mexico to your local grocery store. The Roman hunger for exotic flavors laid the groundwork for a globalized palate, where the world is quite literally on your plate. Then there's the matter of excess. The popular narrative paints Roman feasts as all-out food orgies, but let's compare them to today's smorgasbords. Ever been to a Las Vegas buffet? Yeah, the Romans might have invented the concept of indulgence, but we've certainly perfected it. The difference is that while Romans used feasts as an avenue for political maneuvering, we often indulge purely for pleasure, or maybe just to get our money's worth. Either way, the line between necessity and indulgence remains as blurry as a post-party hangover. And let's not forget the lessons in economic disparity. The divide between the Roman elite and the everyday citizen was as wide as the Tiber River, a disparity mirrored today in the gap between haute cuisine and fast food. Just like the average Roman survived on bread and olives, many people today rely on budget-friendly meals to get by. Despite the passage of time, access to quality food still reflects deep-seated societal inequalities. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Roman feasting culture is the universal truth that food is never just about sustenance. It's a vehicle for social connection, a means of displaying status, and sometimes a way to wield power. Whether it's a diplomatic dinner or a casual get-together, the act of sharing a meal is as much about the relationships around the table as it is about the food on it. The Romans knew this intimately, and it's a lesson we continue to live by. So, what's the takeaway from our Roman revelry redux? It's that feasting, whether ancient or modern, serves as a mirror reflecting the values and intricacies of its time. It reveals a culture's aspirations and anxieties, its obsessions and its excesses. While we may not be stuffing dormice or sipping on Pascha, the essence of using food as a statement, as a connection, and as a tool for maneuvering through life's complex social maze is still very much alive. As we wrap up our historical banquet, remember that every meal is more than just a collection of calories. It's a moment in time, a chance to reflect on who we are and where we've come from. From the flickering lamps of a Roman triclinium to the dim glow of a modern dining room. Food continues to be the centerpiece of human experience, a testament to our never-ending quest for connection, comfort, and maybe just a little bit of clout. So next time you sit down to eat, raise a glass to our Roman predecessors, whose feasting antics remind us that while the world changes, the timeless dance of dining and dialogue remains ever the same. In the labyrinthine alleys of Victorian London, where fog and industry mingled like dubious dance partners, food safety was little more than a pipe dream. If you were hoping for a regulation or two to keep your crumpets from being laced with mystery ingredients, well, you might as well have wished upon a star. The era's urbanization was a roaring success story, and by success, I mean it was an all-you-can-eat buffet of chaos and questionable culinary practices. By 1851, London was a sprawling beast, a city of over 6 million. People flocked from the countryside like moths to a gaslight, drawn by the promise of work in this industrial wonderland. But here's the kicker. With all those bodies packed into the city like sardines in a tin, feeding them became a Herculean task. Enter the age of cheap, accessible treats, if you can call them that without doing a spit take. Industrialization was the great disruptor, not just for looms and steam engines, but for eating habits too. The rise of factories meant more workers needing quick, affordable sustenance. Cue the Victorian version of fast food, where the menu included a side of industrial grime. It was an age where fresh and nutritious were as rare as a dodo sighting. Markets were awash with snacks that were easier on the wallet than on the stomach. But don't let the quaint image of a street vendor with a warm smile and a tray of goodies fool you. Lurking behind these bustling stalls was a rogues gallery of food adulterators. These were the unsung villains who made today's food scandals seem as mild as a soggy sandwich. Think about it. These guys were the original food hackers, but instead of coding, they were cutting flour with chalk and selling it to unsuspecting customers. Yum, right. Let's talk numbers. In 1850, a loaf of bread could cost a working-class family about 5% of their weekly income. Imagine dropping a fiver today on a loaf, only to find out it's half plaster of Paris. And that's not just a hypothetical horror story. It was a grim reality. The Victorians had a penchant for cutting corners that would make even the shadiest modern food company blush. Consider this. Alum, a compound used in dyeing fabrics, found its way into bread to keep it white and fluffy. Because why not douse your daily staple in something that strips color from cloth? And if bread wasn't your thing, maybe you'd fancy some pickles with copper to give them that vibrant green. Who needs natural colors when you have the periodic table at your disposal? These culinary crimes were just the tip of the iceberg. Milk was often watered down, sometimes with the delightful addition of chalk to keep it looking creamy. If you were really lucky, your pint might even have a splash of formaldehyde to keep it fresh. It's enough to make anyone swear off dairy. Of course, where there's smoke, there's usually fire, or in this case, arsenic. That's right, the Victorian sweet tooth often came with a lethal bite. Sweets were colored with a rainbow of toxic pigments, and arsenic was the shiny star of the show. A candy called Humbug Billy became infamous in 1858 after it killed more than 20 people and poisoned dozens more. The culprit, arsenic-laced peppermint lozenges. Talk about a killer confection. The appeal of these cheap treats wasn't just economic. They were also a form of escapism, a sugary respite from the grim realities of urban life. It's easy to romanticize the past, picturing Dickensian street scenes with chimney sweeps and horse-drawn carriages. But the truth was grittier. For many, a penny sweet was a brief taste of luxury in a world where luxury was as distant as the moon. But let's not get too misty-eyed about those Victorian delicacies. They were a public health disaster waiting to happen, and happen it did. The outcry against food adulteration wasn't just a moral crusade. It was a survival tactic. When your daily bread is a chemical experiment, you start to question things. Enter Frederick Occam, the chemist and early whistleblower who in 1820 penned a treatise on adulterations of food and culinary poisons. Occam's work was like dropping a bombshell in the food industry, calling out the rampant fraud and malpractices. He famously warned, "There is death in the part," a phrase that might as well have been the era's culinary motto. Occam wasn't alone in his crusade. The public's growing awareness finally spurred legislative action. The 1860 Adulteration of Food and Drink Act was a landmark moment, the Victorian equivalent of dropping the mic on shoddy food practices. It was a baby step toward accountability, setting the stage for more rigorous food safety laws in the future. Yet, the Victorians' love-hate relationship with their cuisine is a cautionary tale for the ages. It reminds us that the seductive promise of cheap and easy can have a nasty aftertaste. Today, we have the luxury of food labels and regulations, but back then, every mealtime was a roll of the dice. It was a world where you are what you eat was less a lifestyle choice and more a grim reality. So next time you bite into a snack, give a nod to those Victorian pioneers who unwittingly paved the way for modern food safety. And remember, if you think your kale smoothie tastes a little off, at least it doesn't have a side of chalk. Now, let's dive deeper into the world of Victorian sweets, where the treats were as colourful as they were deadly. The Victorians had a sweet tooth that could rival any modern sugar addict, but their candy was less a delightful indulgence and more a chemical cocktail. Picture this: a child with sticky fingers, a penny clutched tightly, eyes gleaming at the vibrant array of candies on display. What they didn't know was that their sweet fix came with a side of lead, mercury, and arsenic. It's like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory if Willy had a side hustle as a mad chemist. Let's unwrap the layers of this sugary saga. At the heart of the Victorian candy craze were sweets like toffees and bullseyes, innocent names for confections that could double as poison pills. These weren't just any candies. They were the rock stars of the sweet world, drawing in crowds with promises of sugary bliss while hiding a dark secret. Take toffees, for example. What could be more comforting than a chewy caramel treat? Well, how about a chewy caramel treat laced with lead acetate to make the colors pop? Yes, you heard right. Lead acetate wasn't just a party crasher. It was the life of the party, making those sweets look ever so tempting. Let's get down to brass tacks with some numbers. The candy industry was booming, and by the mid-1800s, sweets were a penny-a-piece luxury that even the poorest could afford. But affordability came at a price, and that price was often your health. Sugar was expensive, so enterprising confectioners stretched it with fillers like plaster of Paris, chalk, and even starch from potatoes. Why use sugar when you can have a potato-flavored candy? Right. The economics were simple. Cut costs, sell more, and never mind if your customers were keeling over. But why stop at just sugar substitutes? The Victorians were all about the aesthetics, and their sweets were no exception. Bright colors equaled big sales, and for that, they turned to a veritable rainbow of toxic pigments. Take the infamous Humbug Billy incident of 1858, where peppermint lozenges were laced with arsenic, leading to over 20 deaths. That's not just a bad day at the candy store. That's a full-blown disaster. And yet, the allure of these sweets was undeniable. They promised a momentary escape from the soot and grime of industrial life, a burst of color in a drab existence. The appeal wasn't just superficial. It was deeply rooted in the socio-economic climate of the time. The working class, trapped in a cycle of grueling labor and meager wages, found solace in these cheap treats. It was an era where a penny sweet was more than just candy. It was a ticket to a brief, sugary respite from reality. The romantic version of Victorian life, with its cobblestone streets and gentlemen in top hats, conveniently glosses over the harsh truth. Life was tough, and sweets were one of the few affordable luxuries. But let's not let these candy makers off the hook so easily. It's tempting to chalk it up to ignorance, but many were well aware of the dangers lurking in their sweets. Profit was the name of the game, and health was merely a footnote. It was a time when consumer protection was as foreign a concept as the internet, and candy makers took full advantage. They were the original spin doctors, masking their toxic treats with a veneer of innocence. The candy industry's dark side was an open secret, yet it took decades for meaningful change to occur. Why? Because the economic interests of the few often outweighed the health of the many. Sound familiar? The parallels to today's food industry scandals are striking, reminding us that history has a knack for repeating itself when we least expect it. But lest we think the Victorians were entirely clueless, there were glimmers of awareness and rebellion against these toxic treats. The 1860 Adulteration of Food and Drink Act, albeit a modest first step, laid the groundwork for future food safety legislation. It was a sign that not everyone was content to let their hard-earned pennies purchase a side of lead poisoning. Society was beginning to wake up to the reality that consumer rights mattered, even in the candy aisle. So, while we might chuckle at the absurdity of Victorian sweets, the lessons they offer are serious. They remind us that the pursuit of profit often comes at a human cost, and that the seductive promise of cheap and easy is rarely as sweet as it seems. Next time you indulge in a piece of candy, take a moment to savor not just the flavor, but the history behind it, a history as rich and complex as the candies themselves. In our next chapter, we'll explore how this cavalcade of culinary chaos eventually led to reforms that reshaped not just the candy industry, but the entire landscape of consumer protection. From the arsenic-laden treats of the 19th century to the more regulated sweets of today, the journey is as fascinating as it is fraught with peril. So, stay tuned as we continue to unravel the twisted tale of Victorian confectionery, a story that's far from over. As Victorian sweets were busy giving arsenic a starring role in the candy aisle, the rest of the food supply wasn't exactly a beacon of health and safety. Let's chew over some of the era's daily staples that made a chemistry set look like child's play. Bread, the cornerstone of the Victorian diet, was a prime victim of culinary skullduggery. Imagine slicing into a loaf only to discover it had more in common with a science experiment than a bakery delight. Bread was often improved using alum, a compound that in theory made loaves wider and fluffier. The catch: alum was the same stuff used to fix dyes in the textile industry. Now, I enjoy a good multitasker as much as the next person, but I'd rather not have my breakfast double as a fabric softener. The economics behind this culinary calamity were simple: make it cheap, sell it fast. Flour was expensive, so bakers padded their products with anything that wouldn't immediately cause a riot. Chalk, ground bone, and even sawdust weren't unheard of. It's as if they were trying to answer the question no one asked: how can we make bread less about sustenance and more about survival? Now, let's address the liquid refreshment that was milk, the supposed balm to soothe your bread-induced woes. One might assume milk was a safer bet, but in Victorian times, it was more diluted than a politician's promise. Milk was routinely watered down, and if you were lucky, it came with a splash of chalk for that extra creamy illusion. Think of it as the original plant-based milk, if your plant was a piece of limestone. If that wasn't enough, some enterprising souls thought it wise to add a dash of formaldehyde, a preservative more at home in a morgue than a milk jug. It was a time when a glass of milk could be a game of Russian roulette, and the stakes were your digestive health. So why, you might ask, did these practices flourish? The short answer is money, or the lack thereof. The Industrial Revolution, that great engine of progress, created an urban landscape where survival often hinged on how far one could stretch a penny. The burgeoning city populations meant a constant demand for affordable food, and suppliers were more than happy to oblige, even if they had to cut a few corners, or a few health codes, to do so. Victorian society was a paradox of opulence and poverty, where the rich dined on fine china, and the poor made do with whatever the local market peddled. The lack of regulation allowed food adulteration to thrive, turning every meal into a potential minefield. And let's not kid ourselves. The authorities were often more invested in maintaining the status quo than in stirring the pot. After all, a hungry worker was a compliant worker, and what they didn't know wouldn't hurt them, until it did. But let's not heap all the blame on the unscrupulous vendors. The Victorian consumer was often complicit in this culinary charade. The quest for cheaper goods was a double-edged sword, and many turned a blind eye to the murky practices behind their daily bread. It was a dance of denial, where ignorance was bliss until the consequences came home to roost. This laissez-faire attitude wasn't just a British phenomenon, it was a hallmark of the age. Across the pond, Americans were dealing with their own version of food fraud, with so-called swill milk being sold in the streets of New York. Produced by cows fed on distillery waste, this milk was as far removed from the idyllic pastoral image as one could get. It was a global issue, and the Victorians, with their penchant for innovation, were at the forefront of this dubious culinary frontier. Yet, beneath this grim reality lay a story of resilience. The outcry against food adulteration wasn't just a reaction, it was a revolution in the making. The public, armed with newfound awareness, began to demand better. They were no longer content to play the part of unwitting guinea pigs in their own kitchens. The the seeds of change were sown, and the 1860 Adulteration of Food and Drink Act was just the beginning. It was the first tentative step towards accountability, a flicker of hope in an otherwise murky landscape. Despite the era's reputation for culinary chaos, it also set the stage for modern food safety. The Victorians, in their quest for cheap sustenance, inadvertently sparked a movement that would reshape how we think about food. Their struggles were not in vain. They were the crucible in which the principles of consumer protection were forged. So, next time you peruse the aisles of your local supermarket, take a moment to appreciate the Victorian legacy. Behind every label, every regulation, lies a history of trial and error, of lessons learned the hard way. The Victorians may have had a knack for turning food into a hazardous affair, but they also laid the groundwork for a safer, more informed future. In our next foray into the world of Victorian snacks, we'll delve into the curious case of street food, a world where the promise of a quick meal was often a prelude to a gastrointestinal adventure. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the culinary quirks of the 19th century, a time when every bite was a bold leap into the unknown. As we continue our culinary escapade through the Victorian streets, let's sink our teeth into the delectable, yet daunting, world of street food. Think of it as the original food truck scene, minus the Instagram filters and artisanal avocado toast. Instead, picture vendors hawking their wares from pushcarts, their offerings as dubious as a shady infomercial. These mobile feasts weren't just a gastronomic gamble. They were a reflection of the era's social and economic tapestry. Street food was the great equalizer, where the upper crust and the working class could, in theory, rub elbows over a greasy bite. But let's not sugarcoat it. This was less a melting pot and more a potluck of peril. For the Victorian working class, street food was both a necessity and a risk. Industrialization had crammed cities with workers like a Victorian version of the Tokyo subway. With long hours and low wages, the urban poor had little choice but to rely on these quick and dirty meals. A piping hot pie from a street vendor might cost a mere penny or two, but it often came with a side of gastrointestinal roulette. Think of it as the era's version of Fear Factor, where the prize was simply surviving your supper. The vendors themselves were a mixed bag. Some were honest purveyors trying to make an honest living in a cutthroat market. Others were more akin to culinary con artists, selling pies stuffed with mystery meat that would have made today's health inspectors faint. Ever wonder what constituted a meat pie in the 1800s? Let's just say the definition was as loose as a Victorian corset after dinner. A concoction of questionable origin, sometimes horse, sometimes rat, occasionally a stray cat, was all fair game. If it walked, crawled, or scampered, it might end up in a crust. Now, let's sprinkle in some hard data. By the 1850, London boasted over 2,000 street vendors, each hoping to turn a profit off the city's insatiable appetite. For many families, these vendors were lifesavers, or at least stomach fillers, providing meals that were cheaper than anything you could whip up at home. And that was the crux of the matter. The economics of street food were simple yet brutal. For the poorest, it was a choice between risking a dodgy dinner or going hungry. But why did such shady practices persist? The answer, my friend, lies in the class dynamics of the era. Victorian society was a veritable Jenga tower of social strata, and the working class was often left holding the wobbliest block. With little political power and even less financial security, they were at the mercy of both market forces and the whims of vendors. The absence of robust food regulations meant that anything could be sold as food, turning the streets into an open-air experiment in Darwinian survival. And while we're on the subject of regulation, or the lack thereof, let's talk about the powers that be, or rather, their convenient absence. Food safety was less a priority and more an afterthought. The laissez-faire attitude of the government ensured that the free market was freer than a bird on the wing, leaving consumers to fend for themselves. Sure, there were the occasional exposés and scandals, like when the Lancet published articles decrying the state of London's food supply. But these were more akin to pebbles tossed into a pond, causing ripples but no waves. Enter the intrepid reformers and muckrakers who slowly began turning the tide. As the 19th century wore on, public outrage over food adulteration grew louder and harder to ignore. Scandals like the infamous Humbug Billy incident were canaries in the coal mine, signaling a need for change. Journalists and chemists alike took up the mantle, exposing the rot at the core of Victorian food practices with a zeal that would make modern investigative reporters proud. Frederick Occam, the chemist we met earlier, wasn't just a lone voice in the wilderness. He was part of a burgeoning movement that saw science as a tool for social progress. His work was echoed by others, leading to the first tentative steps toward food regulation. The 1860 Adulteration of Food and Drink Act was groundbreaking, but it was just the opening salvo in a longer battle for consumer rights. This legislative milestone didn't happen in a vacuum. It was fueled by a rising tide of public consciousness. As literacy rates improved and newspapers became more accessible, information spread like wildfire. The average citizen was no longer content to be a passive participant in the food chain. They demanded transparency and accountability. It was a seismic shift, a prelude to the consumer protection movements we often take for granted today. Yet, we can't ignore the role of economic disparity in this saga. The Victorian era, with its Dickensian divide between the haves and have-nots, created a fertile ground for exploitation. The wealthy could afford to be choosy, dining on delicacies with a stamp of quality. The poor, however, were left to navigate a minefield of mystery meats and tainted treats. It was a stark reminder that poverty often comes with a side of powerlessness, a cold reality that resonates even today. But if there's a silver lining to this cloud of culinary chaos, it's the story of resilience and reform. The public's growing awareness and demand for change eventually bore fruit, leading to more stringent regulations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The establishment of the Food and Drugs Act in 1875 marked a significant turning point, setting the stage for modern food safety standards. So, as we wrap up this chapter of our Victorian food adventure, let's not forget the lessons it imparts. The past may be a foreign country, but its echoes linger in today's world. The Victorian struggle for safe and affordable food paved the way for the regulatory frameworks we now rely on. It was a long and winding road, peppered with pitfalls and triumphs, but it led us to a place where we can enjoy our meals with a degree of confidence our ancestors could only dream of. Stay with us as we continue to delve deeper into this historical smorgasbord. In our next installment, we'll explore the impact of these food reforms and how they shape the culinary landscape of the 20th century. From street food to supermarkets, the evolution of food safety is a tale as rich and varied as the flavors it encompasses. So, keep your appetites whetted for more as we journey onward through the annals of edible history. And so, like a Victorian penny sweet, the century rolled on, leaving its bittersweet legacy behind. The food scandals of the 19th century might seem like the stuff of nightmares. Candies spiked with arsenic, bread bulked up with chalk, but they were a wake-up call that resonated across time. It's the kind of history that reminds us how necessity, rather than invention, is often the mother of regulation. After all, when your daily bread risks doubling as a chemistry experiment, even the laissez-faire Victorians had to draw a line somewhere. The birth of modern food safety standards was as much about survival as it was about progress. The 1860 Adulteration of Food and Drink Act was just the opening act, a shout in the dark that demanded a chorus of change. Fast forward to 1875, and the Food and Drugs Act took center stage, laying down the law with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a manifesto for the rights of the consumer. It established the precedent that food should be what it claims to be, and not a roulette wheel of potential poisons. The act finally gave local authorities the power to prosecute offenders, a legal glove slap that signaled the end of the free-for-all food market. These early regulations were the trailblazers, the proto-advocates of consumer protection, and they set the stage for the 20th century to refine and expand upon. Fast forward to today, and we've got food safety standards coming out of our ears. You've got your FDA in the United States, the European Food Safety Authority across the pond, and countless other bodies worldwide making sure your sandwich doesn't come with a side of salmonella. The echoes of Victorian struggles are felt in every label we read and every recall notice we heed. It's a legacy of vigilance born out of necessity, a testament to the resilience of those who demanded better. But let's not get too smug and start patting ourselves on the back just yet. For every step forward, there's always a tango backward, and food safety is no exception. Modern food controversies abound, proving that while we've come a long way since arsenic-laced humbugs, we're still dancing with familiar partners. Whether it's horse meat masquerading as beef in European burgers, or the romaine lettuce, E. coli debacles that seem to crop up like clockwork, it's clear we're not immune to culinary cataclysms. These modern scandals remind us that the temptations of cost-cutting and corner-slashing are as strong now as they were when Victorian bakers had their hands in the alum jar. So have we truly learned from the past, or are we just recycling old plots with new players? It's a question as gnarly as a Victorian meat pie, and the answer isn't as tidy as we'd like. On one hand, the legacy of those early food scandals is undeniable. We have watchdogs, regulations, and a public that's more informed than ever before. Transparency is the new black, and consumer rights are enshrined in law. Yet, on the flip side, the relentless pursuit of profit still casts a long and shadowy silhouette over the industry. It's a high-stakes game where the players have changed, but the rules of engagement remain eerily familiar. Consider the economic context. The global food market is a behemoth, an intricate web where cutting costs can mean the difference between surviving and thriving. Just like in the days of Dickens, the pressure to deliver cheap, abundant food can lead to shortcuts that would make a Victorian food adulterator nod in approval. It's a high-wire act, balancing quality with quantity, and sometimes the safety net is woefully thin. Yet, hope springs eternal, or at least it should. The Victorian era's culinary chaos was a crucible that forged the principles we hold dear today. It taught us the hard-won lesson that food safety isn't just a luxury, but a necessity. It's a reminder that while history has a habit of repeating itself, it also evolves. The question isn't whether we'll face new food scandals. Spoiler alert, we will. But whether we'll be ready to meet them head-on with the lessons of the past firmly in hand. And so, as we draw the curtain on our Victorian culinary escapade, let's take a moment to toast the pioneers of food safety. They weren't just fighting for their daily bread. They were crafting a legacy that echoes in every farmer's market and grocery store aisle today. Their struggles remind us that vigilance and advocacy are as crucial now as they were in the soot-covered streets of 19th century London. So next time you bite into a snack, give a nod to the past and savor the knowledge that you're part of a story that's still unfolding, one bite at a time. Standing in the heart of a bustling Mayan city, surrounded by the rhythmic pulse of ancient life, where the air is as thick with humidity as it is with mystery. The sun's rays dance off the grand pyramids, casting long shadows that stretch toward the horizon. At the center of this vibrant tapestry is the Mayan priest, a figure wrapped in both spiritual mystique and political clout. Forget the notion of a mere religious leader. These priests were the CEOs of ancient Mayan society. They wielded influence like a double-edged sword, their roles as diverse as the feathers that adorned their ceremonial garb. Now, let's talk about those feathers. You might think they're just for show, but in the Mayan world, they were loaded with meaning. Imagine rocking a headdress that tells everyone you're not just any guy who knows how to chant a few incantations, but a bona fide power player. These plumes weren't just fashion statements, they were status symbols. The more vibrant and rare the feathers, think the iridescent quetzal, the more clout you commanded. In a world where your attire could make or break your reputation, dressing like a peacock was a sign you were someone to reckon with. These priests were the custodians of the Mayan calendar, a mind-bending system of timekeeping that makes your digital smartwatch look like a sundial. Picture this. Instead of just one calendar, the Mayans operated on a dizzying cycle of 3. There was the Tzolk'in, a 260-day calendar used for religious events, the Harb, a 365-day solar calendar, and the calendar round, a 52-year cycle that combined the two. If you ever thought juggling work schedules and social plans was tough, try organizing a civilization based on multiple overlapping time systems. These priests were basically the original time travelers, predicting everything from the best time to plant maize to forecasting the outcomes of battles. Talk about job pressure. Their influence stretched far beyond the spiritual realm. Imagine being the go-to advisor for kings, the one whispering divine insights into the royal ear. When the king wanted to know if it was a good day to go to war, or perhaps just throw a killer party. It was the priests who consulted the calendar and made the call. Their predictions could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin, making them indispensable, yet occasionally controversial figures in the political landscape. But let's not get too carried away with romanticizing these guys. Being a Mayan priest wasn't all feathered headdresses and calendar consultations. There were some pretty grim realities to the job, too. Bloodletting rituals, for instance, were a common practice. As in, hey, let's slice open a body part to communicate with the gods. Kind of common. It's a bit more intense than your average Sunday service. These rituals were believed to maintain cosmic order and appease the gods, a necessary duty that was as brutal as it was sacred. While the Mayan priests were busy managing the celestial and terrestrial, let's not ignore the economic engine that kept the whole society humming. The Mayans were no strangers to trade and commerce, with their cities thriving as economic hubs. Priests played a crucial role here too, often involved in the organization of markets and the regulation of goods. Their influence ensured that the economic gears ran smoothly, making them indispensable in both spiritual and practical realms. So, why did all this matter? Why did a civilization go to such lengths to glorify these individuals in feathers and rituals? Simply put, the priests were the glue that held the fabric of Mayan society together. They were the interpreters of divine will and the architects of political strategy. In a world where the spiritual and political were inextricably linked, their roles were not just important, they were essential. As you walk through this world of stone pyramids and jungle echoes, remember that behind every sacred rite and royal decision stood a priest, guiding the course of history with a steady hand and a feathered headdress. As you saunter through the jungle of history, trailing behind those feathered headdresses and celestial predictions, you're about to trip over some of the more eyebrow-raising customs of Mayan priests. If you thought their gig was all about deciphering star maps and hobnobbing with royalty, brace yourself. The Mayan priests were also the maestros of rituals that make your local haunted house look like a theme park for toddlers. We're talking bloodletting and human sacrifice, ceremonies that sound like they were ripped straight from a horror flick, complete with a dramatic soundtrack of drums and conch shells. Let's start with bloodletting, which is exactly as metal as it sounds. Picture a priest standing atop a pyramid, holding a thorn-studded rope, about to engage in a little DIY surgery to chat with the gods. This wasn't just a random act of masochism. Blood was seen as the life force, the ultimate offering to deities. By spilling their own blood, or better yet, that of a royal family member, priests believed they were ensuring cosmic stability. It was the divine equivalent of paying your utility bill on time. But here's where Hollywood often gets it wrong. Contrary to what you might see on screen, these rituals weren't happening every Tuesday like clockwork. They were reserved for significant occasions. Think royal coronations, major agricultural events, or when things really hit the fan, like a drought or an unfavorable celestial alignment. And while these scenes are often portrayed as chaotic and violent, they were actually highly ceremonial, with strict protocols and an air of solemnity. Now, onto the big-ticket event, human sacrifice. It's the stuff of legends and nightmares. Yes, human sacrifice was a part of Mayan rituals, but let's not go overboard. These were not daily occurrences. They were rare, reserved for the most dire of times or the most significant of events. And if you're picturing a conveyor belt of victims, think again. This was a costly affair, both economically and socially. It wasn't just about offering a life. It was about presenting the best of the best. Captives of war, especially those of high status, were prime candidates, as their sacrifice was believed to hold the greatest spiritual weight. Economically speaking, a sacrifice was like throwing a lavish state banquet. It demanded resources, the construction of elaborate altars, the preparation of ceremonial attire, and the gathering of the community. This was an investment in divine favor, a transaction with the gods where the currency was life itself. When the priests orchestrated a sacrifice, they were essentially rolling the dice on the future of their city-state. If it paid off, crops would flourish, and the rains would come. If not, well, let's just say it was a high-stakes game of spiritual poker. Here's where we debunk another myth. Not every Mayan city-state was a sacrifice-happy cult. The frequency and nature of these rituals varied significantly across regions and time periods. Some areas were more inclined toward bloodletting, others towards human sacrifice, and some leaned into more symbolic offerings like incense or food. The Mayan world wasn't a monolith. It was a patchwork of cultures, each with its own twist on the divine dialogue. Speaking of twists, let's talk about the economic implications of these rituals. Imagine you're running a city-state. You've got the political bigwigs, the priests, and the common folks, all with mouths to feed and a calendar full of cosmic events to manage. Every ritual, especially those involving sacrifice, was a drain on resources. You had to balance the spiritual needs of the community with the practicalities of sustaining it. It's no wonder priests were some of the shrewdest operators around, weaving together religious duties with economic strategies that would make any modern CFO nod in approval. These rituals, as grim as they might seem, were integral to the societal structure. They reinforced the priest's authority, validated the ruler's power, and united the populace under a shared belief system. In a world where the line between the sacred and the everyday was blurred, these ceremonies were as much about politics and economics as they were about piety and appeasement. So, the next time you catch a Hollywood epic featuring a Mayan priest, remember there's more to the story. Behind the dramatic rituals and colorful myths lies a complex system of beliefs, economics, and politics. It's a reminder that history, much like life, is rarely black and white. It's a spectrum of colors, as vibrant and varied as the feathers in a Mayan headdress. And as we continue to explore this ancient world, keep your eyes open for the unexpected twists and turns that make history not just a record of the past, but a living narrative that still echoes today. Now that we've peeled back the layers of ritual and sacrifice, let's wander into the priestly duties that didn't involve spilling blood or deciphering cosmic calendars. Welcome to the agricultural side of Mayan priesthood, a realm where these feathered figures don the hats of meteorologists, agricultural advisors, and sometimes the world's first PR agents. If you've ever cursed your local weather app for getting it wrong, spare a thought for the Mayan farmer who relied on a guy with a feathered headdress and a penchant for astronomy to tell him when to plant his crops. These priests, with their eyes on the skies, were essentially the original weathermen of the Mesoamerican world. Equipped with an uncanny understanding of the stars, they advised farmers on the best times to sow and harvest. The Maya had no John Deere tractors, but what they lacked in machinery, they made up for with astrological acumen. The priests' predictions about rain and drought weren't just educated guesses. They were based on careful observation of celestial events. For instance, the rising of the Pleiades constellation signaled the start of the rainy season. If it didn't show up on time, well, let's just say the priests had some serious explaining to do. Imagine the pressure. One wrong call, and you're not just dealing with a few soggy sandwiches at a picnic. You're talking crop failure, famine, and a very angry populace. In a world where a good harvest meant the difference between life and death, the role of the priest was as crucial as it was nerve-wracking. It's no wonder they relied on the stars. Those things have been more reliable than most politicians. The Mayan priesthood was a bit like a celestial stock exchange, with farmers and rulers hanging on their every word. When they said plant, people planted. When they predicted drought, preparations were made. Their influence over agriculture was profound, and it's no hyperbole to say that the very survival of the city-states often rested on their predictions. The priests had to juggle not only the whims of the cosmos, but also the expectations of a society that was deeply intertwined with the cycles of nature. Now, let's add another layer to this heady mix: politics. These priests weren't just spiritual advisors. They were the original spin doctors, crafting narratives that kept rulers in power and the masses in line. Picture it. A priest stands before the king, weaving a tale from the stars that just so happens to endorse the king's latest policy. Whether it was declaring a divine mandate for war or a celestial blessing for an alliance, priests were the mouthpiece of the gods, and by extension, the king. In this cosmic dance, the king and the priest were partners. The king needed the priest's astral seal of approval to legitimize his rule, while the priest needed the king's support to maintain his status. It was a symbiotic relationship built on mutual necessity and a shared interest in the smooth running of their realm. Think of it as a medieval version of "you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours," with a bit more bloodletting and a lot more feathers. But let's not romanticize this too much. The priests weren't infallible, and their predictions didn't always hit the mark. When things went awry, scapegoating was a favorite pastime. Sometimes the stars just didn't cooperate, and when the harvest failed or the rains didn't come, someone had to take the fall. Despite their spiritual clout, priests could find themselves out of favor and out of a job faster than you can say solar eclipse. In the political arena, priests also acted as advisors, helping kings navigate the murky waters of alliances and enmities. Just as today's politicians rely on advisors, Mayan rulers leaned on the wisdom of their priests. In a society where the divine and the mundane were inextricably linked, having a direct line to the gods, or claiming to, was an invaluable asset. It's no exaggeration to say that priests were instrumental in shaping the political landscape of the Maya world. And let's not forget the economic angle. The ceremonies and rituals over which priests presided were not just spiritual affairs. They were also major economic events. Markets often sprang up around these gatherings, with traders peddling everything from textiles to food. The priests, with their ceremonial duties, were at the heart of this economic activity, helping to regulate trade and ensure the smooth flow of goods. It was a balancing act of the highest order, keeping the spiritual, political, and economic plates spinning in perfect harmony. So, as you meander through the annals of history, guided by the flickering torchlight of Mayan priesthood, remember that these figures were far more than their feathered headdresses and blood-stained altars. They were the architects of a civilization, the bridge between the celestial and the terrestrial, the weavers of tales that held the power to make, or break, a king. And while the myths and legends may paint them as mystical figures, the reality was often more complex, more human, and infinitely more fascinating. As we continue to unravel the threads of their story, keep your eyes on the stars, and your feet firmly planted on the ground. As we drift from the grand tapestry of Mayan priests' celestial navigation, let's zoom in on how one actually became a master of the cosmos and a king's confidant. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a walk in the jungle park. Becoming a Mayan priest was a rigorous journey, akin to climbing an academic Everest with no Sherpas, just a lot of sweat, study, and maybe some divine intervention. First off, forget any notions you have of a priestly lottery or divine calling. No angelic choirs here. To even sniff the incense-laden air of priesthood, you needed to be born into the right family. This was the original old boys' club, where lineage mattered more than a killer resume. You see, the Mayans had a knack for blending nepotism with meritocracy. You had to come from a line of priests or nobles, ensuring that the spiritual secrets and political savvy stayed in trusted hands. Once your birth lottery ticket was punched, the real grind began. Becoming a priest was no weekend workshop. It was a full-blown apprenticeship that started in childhood and could stretch over decades. Imagine Hogwarts, but with a lot more mathematics and a lot less Quidditch. You'd be knee-deep in star charts, shadow measurements, and ritual incantations. We're talking about a curriculum that would make modern STEM programs look like a cakewalk. Astronomy wasn't just a hobby, it was the backbone of your education, and mastering it was non-negotiable. Now, let's talk about the educational system. Forget the image of a quaint classroom setting with a sage-like figure imparting wisdom. The Mayan schools, known as kamikaks, were rigorous institutions where rote learning was the name of the game. That means hours upon hours of memorizing everything from the cycles of Venus to the sacred chants that would make or break a ritual. And we're not just talking about a few years of study. It could take a solid 15 to 20 years to ascend to the rank of a full-fledged priest. Oh, and the costs. Becoming a priest didn't just demand time. It demanded resources. Families had to fork over goods, think cacao beans, textiles, and even precious jade, to support their budding priest's education. It was like paying Ivy League tuition, but instead of a diploma, you got a headdress and a lifetime gig of celestial consulting. But wait, there's more. Education wasn't just about the stars and the chants. You had to be a jack of all trades, mastering agriculture, politics, and even the art of persuasion. A priest's education was a crash course in Mayan civilization, preparing you to play a pivotal role in every aspect of society. The priests weren't just spiritual leaders. They were the original multi-hyphenates, blending the roles of scientist, economist, and diplomat. Here's where we debunk another myth, the notion that priests were aloof scholars locked away in ivory towers. Far from it. These guys were more like social butterflies, flitting from royal court to civic meeting, always in the mix. Their training demanded they be adaptable, able to switch from discussing the implications of a solar eclipse with a king to advising farmers on crop rotations. Yet, with great power came great responsibility and scrutiny. Rising through the priestly ranks was as much about avoiding pitfalls as it was about climbing ladders. One miscalculation of a celestial event or a botched ritual could see you demoted faster than you could say calendar round. The stakes were high, and the pressure was relentless. Let's not forget the social dynamics. Becoming a priest wasn't just a personal achievement, it was a family affair. Your success elevated your entire lineage, bringing honor and influence. But that also meant your failures were all too public. It was a tightrope walk of epic proportions, balancing familial expectations with the ever-present demands of the divine. And while we're myth-busting, let's bust the idea that all priests were created equal. There was a hierarchy within the priesthood, a ladder with rungs as slippery as they were steep. You didn't just wake up one morning as a high priest. You started at the bottom as an acolyte before moving up to more senior positions like the Arkin, the daykeeper, or the Ahorcan, the head priest. Each step required proving your mettle, both intellectually and spiritually. At the pinnacle of this priestly pyramid stood the Ahau, the high priest, a position reserved for the best of the best. This was the guy who could interpret the will of the gods and turn it into actionable policy. Reaching this level was akin to becoming the CEO of a spiritual corporation, complete with the perks and pitfalls of the role. The Ahau wielded immense power, but also bore the weight of the world, or at least the weight of the city-state, on his feathered shoulders. So, as we peel back the layers of Mayan priesthood, remember that these figures were more than just mystical figures in a history book. They were real people, navigating a complex web of societal expectations, spiritual duties, and personal ambitions. Their journey was one of dedication, sacrifice, and no small amount of intrigue. And as we continue this trek through the annals of history, keep in mind that the story of the Mayan priests is one of both celestial wonder and earthly reality, a tale as rich and varied as the civilization they helped to shape. As we journey from the heights of priestly power to the trenches of their decline, let's unravel the tapestry of pressures, both external and internal, that tugged the Mayan priesthood from its lofty perch. Imagine the closing scenes of a gripping drama, where external invasions and internal strife collide in a crescendo of historical upheaval. And no, this isn't just a plot twist, it's the real deal. First, let's dive into the external forces. Picture the Mayan city-states, once thriving centers of culture and commerce, now facing the relentless advance of the Spanish conquistadors in the early 16th century. The Spanish didn't exactly knock politely. They barged in like a bull in a china shop, armed with steel, gunpowder, and foreign diseases that decimated the local population faster than you can say smallpox. The conquistadors were indifferent to the celestial authority of the priests, and they had a knack for toppling idols and building churches atop sacred temples, as if to say, your gods are out, ours are in. But the Spanish weren't the only threat. The Mayan world was already a simmering cauldron of internal conflict. City-states often squabbled like siblings over resources, territory, and influence. These rivalries meant that any unified front against outside invaders was about as likely as a snowstorm in the Yucatan. As if that weren't enough, environmental pressures, like prolonged droughts, added to the chaos, turning fertile lands into dust bowls. You can't exactly consult the stars to bring back the rain when you're in the midst of a climatic crisis. Internally, the priesthood itself was not immune to the pressures of change. As resources dwindled, so too did the economic support that kept the priestly class in feathers and fine regalia. With the decline of urban centers, the elaborate rituals and grand ceremonies that once symbolized the divine order became increasingly difficult to sustain. The priests, once seen as the linchpins of Mayan society, found their influence waning as the practical challenges of survival took precedence over celestial alignments. And let's not gloss over the political shifts. As city-states crumbled, so did the delicate balance of power that kept priests in their roles as kingmakers. The once symbiotic relationship between rulers and priests frayed as leaders struggled to maintain their grip on power, often scapegoating priests when things went south. It's a classic case of blame the guy in the fancy hat when the crops fail or the enemy is at the gates. So, What's left of this once mighty priesthood in today's world? Let's take a stroll through the legacy of the Mayan priests, which is as enduring as it is complex. Their influence echoes through the descendants of the Maya, who still practice traditional rituals and ceremonies, albeit with a modern twist. In places like Guatemala and southern Mexico, the ancient calendar systems are still consulted, not just for planting crops, but for marking significant life events. These practices serve as a cultural lifeline, connecting modern-day Maya to their storied past. And speaking of connections, let's not forget the tourism industry's love affair with the Maya. Today, sites like Chichen Itza, Tikal, and Palenque draw millions of visitors annually, turning ancient ruins into bustling hubs of economic activity. Tour guides spin tales of sacred rituals and celestial wonders, while visitors snap selfies with pyramids in the background, perhaps imagining themselves as ancient astronomers, if only for a moment. It's a romanticized image, sure, but one that keeps the cash registers ringing and the cultural significance alive. Yet, as we peer through the kaleidoscope of history, it's worth asking whether the romanticized image of Mayan priests holds up under scrutiny. These figures, often depicted as mystical sages with unfathomable knowledge, were also products of their time, pragmatic operators navigating a world where the line between the divine and the everyday was as blurry as a sunbeam through the jungle canopy. In reality, the priests were not infallible oracles, but humans balancing the scales of power, belief, and survival. They were as much administrators as they were spiritual guides, their celestial insights often tempered by the harsh realities of political machinations and economic necessities. So, while the myths may paint them as otherworldly figures, the truth is far more nuanced, a reminder that history is both legend and fact, a tapestry of stories woven together by the threads of human endeavor. As we wrap up this exploration of Mayan priesthood, remember that history is not just a record of what happened, but an ongoing dialogue between the past and the present. The legacy of the Mayan priests is not simply etched in stone or preserved in ancient texts. It lives on in the hearts and minds of those who continue to honor their traditions, even as they navigate the complexities of the modern world. And so, as you ponder the echoes of the past, consider this. History, much like the stars, is a guide, not a destination. Keep looking up, and keep questioning the stories that shape our world. In the swirling fog of Victorian London, where top hats and gas lamps defined the skyline, a curious phenomenon was brewing beneath the stiff collars and lace gloves. Picture a society where laudanum, a heady concoction of opium and alcohol, was as commonplace as a cup of Earl Grey. It was the kind of wellness trend that Gwyneth Paltrow might have endorsed had she been born a couple of centuries earlier. Laudanum was the elixir of choice for everything from pesky headaches to full-blown existential crises. Got a toothache? Laudanum. Feeling a bit melancholy? Laudanum. Losing a duel? Laudanum. And maybe a new hobby. The Victorians were nothing if not practical. But before we delve into the nitty-gritty of this intoxicating love affair, let's talk about the opium itself. This wasn't some backyard operation. By 1890, Britain was importing over 280,000 pounds of opium annually. That's a lot of poppies. And where did it all come from? India, of course. The British East India Company was raking in profits, shipping opium from the fields of Bengal to the bustling ports of London. It was a classic case of imperial economics, with a side of moral ambiguity. While the British were busy getting their fix, they were also fueling the opium wars with China. Talk about a double-edged sword. Now, if you think this was a vice reserved for the well-to-do, brace yourself. Opium was the great social equalizer. Aristocrats and paupers alike found solace in its warm embrace. It was as if the entire city had collectively decided to swap sobriety for a more opium-enhanced existence. And why not? Life was tough. The Industrial Revolution had turned London into a gritty, belching machine. Child labor was rampant, sanitation was abysmal, and the air quality was roughly equivalent to chain-smoking a pack of cigars at once. Opium was the cloud of comfort hovering over all that grime. Here's where it gets really interesting, or disturbing, depending on your perspective. The Victorians were nothing if not innovative in their consumption. Laudanum was often sold in opulently designed bottles, making it the must-have accessory for the fashionable addicted. The likes of Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Barrett Browning were rumoured to have dabbled. It wasn't just for the poets and novelists, though. Housewives used it to soothe teething babies, which seems like a questionable parenting choice in retrospect, but was considered perfectly normal at the time. If parenting books had existed back then, they might have been sponsored by the local apothecary. But let's not mistake this for a harmless quirk of history. The epidemic was a cocktail of convenience and dependency, with a dash of ignorance for good measure. Medical professionals, armed with little more than guesswork and a penchant for bleeding their patients, prescribed it with reckless abandon. The results were predictably tragic for many. Addiction was rampant, though it wasn't called that back then. Dependence, addiction, or just a bit of a habit, it didn't matter what you called it when you were knee-deep in the stuff. The real kicker, laudanum was cheap, dirt cheap. You could buy a bottle for pennies, which made it accessible to even the poorest Londoners. It was touted as a miracle cure, endorsed by doctors and quacks alike. The economics of it all were staggering. While opium imports lined the pockets of the British Empire, they also lined the streets with people teetering on the edge of ruin. So, in this world of social stratification and industrial chaos, laudanum was the equal opportunity destroyer. It didn't care who you were or what you did. It was there to take the edge off, with the small print conveniently omitted. The romantic image of the tortured Victorian artist, bottle in hand, is tempting, but let's not forget the grim reality beneath the myth. The opioid epidemic was a tangled web of economic interests, societal pressures, and personal tragedies, all swirled together in a bottle of harmless medicine. As the saying goes, the road to dependence is paved with good intentions, and a whole lot of opium. And speaking of good intentions, let's take a stroll down the cobblestone streets of Victorian London, where women were living in a world that seemed as though it was crafted to keep them in a perpetual state of delicate health. It's the 19th century, and women's roles were as rigid as the whalebone corsets they wore, tight, constricting, and likely to leave a mark. Society expected them to be the angels of the house, nurturing everyone but themselves, and maintaining a facade of serene domesticity while spinning like dervishes on the inside. It was a tough gig, and you could say they had a little help from a certain opium-laced bottle. Opium, in its laudanum disguise, was the Victorian woman's little secret, a secret shared by many, given that laudanum was prescribed as liberally as one might hand out aspirin today. Doctors were practically giving it away like candy at Halloween, with rather dubious medical practices to back them up. It's no wonder, really, given that the medical profession at the time was less about science and more about trial and error. Mostly error. Got the vapors? Laudanum. Nervous disposition? Laudanum. Found yourself suddenly hysterical, which is code for being anything other than perfectly docile. You guessed it, laudanum. The thing is, Victorian doctors were the kind of folks who might have considered a seance a valid diagnostic tool. Their understanding of medicine was a curious blend of superstition and pseudoscience, with a dash of leeches thrown in for good measure. They didn't just recommend opium for the odd ache or pain. It was the goda for pretty much any ailment that couldn't be cured by a brisk walk or a stiff upper lip. And so, opium became the household remedy for everything from menstrual cramps to migraines, with a marketing campaign that would make even the most enthusiastic modern-day pharmaceutical rep blush. Now, let's talk about those pesky social expectations. Women were expected to embody the virtues of the ideal Victorian lady: demure, compliant, and perpetually cheerful. Emotional outbursts were about as welcome as a rat in a pantry. If a woman dared to exhibit any sign of emotional turmoil, the diagnosis was often hysteria, a catch-all term that could mean anything from legitimate anxiety to simply having an opinion. And what was the cure? Well, opium, of course. It was the 19th century equivalent of telling someone to calm down, only in liquid form. But why was laudanum such a hit among women? For starters, it was a relief from the monotony and pressures of domestic life. Imagine managing a household without the convenience of modern technology or even a semblance of gender equality. It was exhausting. Add to that the societal pressure to remain ever so pleasant, and you've got a recipe for stress that even a Victorian fainting couch couldn't fix. Enter laudanum, the potion that promised tranquility in a tumultuous world. And let's not forget the economics of it all. Laudanum was cheap, cheaper than tea, in fact. For a few pence, a woman could purchase a bottle of this miraculous concoction, granting her a temporary escape from the drudgery of daily life. It was a small luxury that even the tightest household budget could accommodate. But like all too-good-to-be-true deals, this one came with strings attached, strings that often led straight to addiction, though the term addiction was not part of the Victorian vocabulary. Instead, women might be described as having a habit, a term that sanitized the grim reality of dependency. And here's a kicker. This wasn't just a private affair. The use of laudanum was so widespread that it became a social norm. Women gathered in parlors and drawing rooms where they might discreetly sip their laudanum-laced teas, perhaps swapping recipes for the best homemade remedies. It was a community bonded by a shared, albeit quiet, dependency on this ubiquitous panacea. But let's not romanticize it. The Victorian image of women languidly reclining with a bottle of laudanum in hand might seem poetic, but the reality was far bleaker. Dependency on opium could lead to a downward spiral of health issues, not to mention the social stigma if one's habit became public knowledge. And while laudanum promised an escape, it was also a trap, a gilded cage that kept women subdued, both physically and socially. All this begs the question, what were the alternatives? Well, not much. The medical community of the time wasn't exactly brimming with options, and mental health support was as archaic as the telephone booth. For Victorian women, laudanum was both a balm and a ball and chain, a reflection of a society that offered scant resources for genuine empowerment or emotional support. In this haze of opium and societal constraint, women found themselves navigating a delicate balance between conformity and autonomy. To be a woman in Victorian London was to walk a tightrope of expectations, with laudanum often serving as the net below, a net that could just as easily ensnare as it could catch. So, as we continue to peel back the layers of this opium-tinted world, remember that beneath the lace and laudanum was a complex web of social, economic, and personal dilemmas. The allure of opium was as much about escape as it was about the societal pressures that drove women to it in the first place, a tangled narrative that we'll unravel further as we delve into the ongoing saga of the Victorian opioid epidemic. With laudanum casting its shadow over Victorian life, the stage was set for an economic drama worthy of a Dickens novel. The pharmacies and patent medicine companies, those early pioneers of the wellness industry, saw the opium epidemic not as a crisis, but as a gold mine. Who needs ethics when profits are on the line? These companies peddled their wares with the gusto of a modern-day infomercial, promising relief from every ailment under the smog-filled sun. Let's talk numbers. By the 1860s, pharmacies were as ubiquitous as Starbucks in Manhattan today. There were over 5,000 of them in England, each one a purveyor of what we might now call alternative facts about health. The opium trade was a lucrative business, and pharmacists were right at the heart of it. They mixed their own concoctions, often with a generous splash of opium, and sold them as miracle cures. In an era before the FDA, there was no regulatory body to spoil the party. The result, an explosion of patent medicines, each more fantastical in its claims than the last. Marketing was shameless. Advertisements, full-page spreads in newspapers and posters plastered around town, promised that opium-laced concoctions could cure anything from gout to female complaints, a euphemism for everything from menstrual cramps to the aforementioned hysteria. The language was as flowery as a Victorian garden party, with products like Dr. Carley's Brown's Chlorodyne claiming to be the ultimate remedy. Brown's potion, let's not forget, was a heady mix of chloroform, morphine, and peppermint oil. You could say it was the minty fresh way to oblivion. And who could resist such promises? Certainly not the families who found themselves unwittingly trapped in the epidemic's grip. Women were the primary targets, and as their dependency grew, the ripple effects spread through every level of family life. A mother who was too sedated to manage her household was no small matter. It meant meals might not be cooked, clothes not mended, and children not tended to with the attentiveness society demanded. Meanwhile, husbands, often blissfully unaware of the true nature of their wives' remedies, were left to pick up the slack or turn a blind eye. It was a recipe for domestic discord. The economic strain was real. Even though laudanum was cheap, the costs added up. A bottle here, a bottle there, and soon enough, household budgets were strained to the breaking point. For the working and lower middle classes, where every penny counted, this could mean the difference between keeping the roof over your head or a trip to the workhouse. It was an insidious cycle. The more stressed the family, the more laudanum was consumed to cope, leading to even greater financial and emotional strain. And let's not forget the children, those silent witnesses to their parents' struggles. In some cases, they were unwittingly enlisted in the opium economy themselves, sent to the local pharmacy to fetch Mama's medicine. It was a grim inheritance, one where dependency and economic hardship were passed down like a family heirloom. The societal implications were profound. The epidemic blurred social lines, as both the wealthy and the working class found themselves ensnared in the same trap. But while the rich could retreat behind closed doors to nurse their dependencies, the poor were left exposed to public scorn. Addiction was seen as a moral failing rather than a medical condition, and it was the poor who bore the brunt of this judgment. It was a double standard that was as much about class as it was about gender. Yet the allure of opium persisted. It was the ultimate double-edged sword, offering both escape and entrapment. The pharmacies and patent medicine companies, meanwhile, continued to rake in profits, their coffers swollen with the spoils of a society in distress. It was a classic case of supply and demand, with a demand that seemed insatiable. As we continue to unravel this tangled tale, it becomes clear that the Victorian opioid epidemic was not just a medical crisis, but a social and economic one as well. The very fabric of society was being reshaped, one laudanum bottle at a time. And while the Victorians may have thought they were buying relief, what they were really purchasing was a one-way ticket to dependency. In our next exploration, we'll delve into how this epidemic influenced the era's cultural and literary output, as well as the nascent stirrings of reform that began to take root. But for now, let's leave our Victorian friends grappling with their opium-fueled realities, teetering on the edge of a new century, where the seeds of change were just beginning to sprout. Hold onto your top hats. It's going to be a bumpy ride. As the 19th century teetered on the brink of the 20th, the British government finally decided it might be time to pay attention to the opium epidemic that was sweeping through its cobblestone streets like a scandalous novel. Enter the 1868 Pharmacy Act, the legislative equivalent of putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. For all its pomp and ceremony, this act was about as effective at controlling opium as a sieve is at holding water. So, what did this act actually do? Well, not much. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 was supposed to regulate the sale of poisons, including opium, by insisting that only qualified pharmacists could sell certain substances. But here's the punchline. The Act didn't specify any particular qualifications, leaving the door wide open for anyone with a storefront and a penchant for mixing potions to continue business as usual. It was as if they'd passed a law saying only people who really liked cake could eat it. Helpful, right? Now, let's talk about why this act was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. The Victorian era was a time when economic interests were the name of the game, and opium was a cash cow that nobody wanted to slaughter. The British Empire was making a tidy sum from importing opium from India, and the local pharmacies were raking it in by selling their opium-laced elixirs. It was a win-win situation, unless you were one of the countless individuals struggling with addiction. But hey, you can't make an imperial economic omelette without breaking a few public health eggs, right? Public health concerns were becoming harder to ignore, yet they were often overshadowed by the clinking of coins in the imperial coffers. The Victorian government found itself caught in a moral conundrum, balancing the need to address an increasingly visible social issue with the economic benefits of the opium trade. It was a bit like asking a fox to guard the henhouse, and then wondering why the eggs kept disappearing. The 1868 Act did little to curb the actual consumption of opium. While it did require that opium be sold only by licensed pharmacists, it didn't stop people from obtaining it elsewhere. Street vendors and unlicensed apothecaries still sold opium under the counter, and with a wink and a nod, you could get your hands on a bottle of laudanum without too much fuss. In a society that thrived on secrecy and discretion, it wasn't too hard for people to keep their habits under wraps. Moreover, the act was riddled with loopholes big enough to drive a horse-drawn carriage through. The definition of poisons was vague. and enforcement was practically non-existent. It was a classic case of legislative theatre, sound and fury signifying very little. Meanwhile, pharmacies continued their merry trade, with opium sales barely skipping a beat. So why didn't the government clamp down harder? Well, there's the rub. Economic interests were deeply entrenched. The opium trade was a cornerstone of British imperial policy, and any significant restriction would have had ripple effects from London to Bengal. The powers that be were caught in a web of their own making, with profits and public health pulling in opposite directions. The struggle between health and wealth played out in the public sphere, too. As the epidemic flourished, so did public discourse. Newspapers ran sensational stories of opium dens and the so-called curse of Laudanum. But these tales often focused more on the exoticism and drama than the stark realities. It was easier to sell newspapers with tales of dimly lit opium dens than with dry legislative debates. The myth of the opium epidemic was as potent as the substance itself. And then there was the social stigma. Addiction was still seen as a personal failing rather than a societal issue. The poor bore the brunt of this judgment, while the wealthy could often hide their dependency behind closed doors. It was a classic case of Victorian double standards, where one's social status determined whether you were seen as a tragic figure or a moral degenerate. Despite the Act's shortcomings, it did begin to stir the pot of reform. The conversation around opium was changing, albeit slowly. Medical professionals started to question the liberal use of opium in their practices, and public health advocates began to push for stricter regulations. But these efforts were often drowned out by the clamor of economic interests and the inertia of a system that was comfortable with the status quo. The Victorian opioid epidemic was a complex tapestry of economic, social, and political threads. The 1868 Pharmacy Act, for all its flaws, was a step toward acknowledging that there was a problem. But it was a step taken with all the urgency of a tourist on a Sunday stroll. The real challenge lay ahead, finding a way to untangle the mess of profit and public health that had ensnared so many. As we continue our journey through this opium-laced saga, we'll see how the voices calling for change began to grow louder. But for now, let's leave our Victorian friends wrestling with a legislative response that was more show than substance, caught in a dance between economic interests and the creeping realization that something had to give. The stage was set for a new era of reform, but for the moment, the curtain was still drawn. Stay tuned. It's a tale worth waiting for. Amidst the bureaucratic fumbling of the 1868 Pharmacy Act, Victorian London continued its sordid love affair with Laudanum. Yet, beneath the romanticized image of elegant women reclining languidly with their opium-laced potions was a far grittier reality. The allure of the tortured Victorian soul has an undeniable pull, like watching a train wreck in slow motion. But let's clear the fog. Laudanum wasn't just a poetic accessory. It was a crutch, a dependency, a societal band-aid on the festering wound of inequality and ignorance. Victorian women, far from the ethereal figures of literary imagination, were caught in a vice grip of societal expectations and medical malpractice. The image of the delicate woman, swooning into the comforting arms of Laudanum, glosses over the grim truth, dependency, health deterioration, and the stark absence of genuine support. Forget the poetic languishing. The reality was more akin to a slow-motion train wreck, inevitable and destructive. Take, for example, the case of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, a notorious concoction that promised to calm infants and soothe mothers. Marketed as a miracle for teething babies, it was essentially morphine syrup. While it might have silenced the cries, it did little for the long-term health of the child or the sanity of the parent. This was no gentle lullaby, but rather a chemical straitjacket, and it was just one of many over-the-counter solutions that contributed to the normalization of opium consumption in daily life. By the late 19th century, the human costs of this epidemic were becoming undeniable. Hospital records from the time began to reflect a worrying trend. Increasing numbers of patients admitted for what we would now recognize as addiction-related issues. The mortality rates associated with laudanum overdoses were climbing, though the exact numbers remain as elusive as a foggy London dawn. What is clear, however, is the growing recognition that the so-called cure was becoming deadlier than the ailments it was meant to treat. But even as the death toll rose, the myth of the Victorian opium dream persisted. Society clung to the notion of the tragic, laudanum-loving artist, a romantic vision that conveniently ignored the wreckage left in the wake of addiction. While the image of a brooding poet clutching a bottle of laudanum may have inspired artistic reverie, it also masked a harsh reality. Many lives were overshadowed by addiction, not just creatively tortured souls, but everyday people, women, men, and children who found themselves ensnared in the opium net. Yet, in the midst of all this, a shift was beginning to stir. By the late 1800, the winds of reform were blowing, albeit softly. The medical community, slowly waking from its opium-induced stupor, began to advocate for change. Pioneers like Dr. Thomas Addis Emmet, a prominent physician of the time, openly criticized the rampant use of opium, calling for more responsible prescribing practices. It was a whisper of reform in a cacophony of denial, but it was a start. Economic pressures also played a role in this budding transformation. As the Industrial Revolution gained steam, the need for a healthy, productive workforce became increasingly apparent. Employers began to notice that a workforce dulled by opium was, unsurprisingly, less efficient. This economic angle provided another nudge towards reform, as the realization dawned that public health was directly linked to economic prosperity. The government, too, started to feel the heat. By the turn of the century, calls for stricter regulation of opium and its derivatives grew louder. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 was a landmark piece of legislation, setting the stage for modern drug regulation by imposing restrictions on the importation and sale of opium. It was a recognition, at long last, that the laissez-faire approach to drug regulation was untenable in a modern society. Despite these steps forward, the legacy of the Victorian opioid epidemic lingers. The romanticism surrounding laudanum has never truly faded, finding echoes in today's pop culture depictions of the period. Yet, as quaint as it may seem to imagine the past through rose-tinted lenses, the reality was anything but enchanting. The human cost was immense, and the societal impacts profound. The epidemic revealed the cracks in the facade of Victorian propriety, exposing the vulnerabilities of a society that prioritized profit over people. As we conclude this opium-laden journey, it's worth reflecting on how history has a knack for repeating itself. The opium epidemic may be a relic of the past, but its echoes are present in today's ongoing struggles with addiction. The allure of the quick fix, the miracle cure, remains as potent now as it did over a century ago. If the Victorian opioid crisis teaches us anything, it's the importance of learning from the past, lest we repeat its mistakes. So, as you tuck this tale away, remember that history is more than just a series of dates and events. It's a mirror, reflecting our triumphs and follies back at us. And as we stare into its depths, we might just find the wisdom to forge a better path forward. Because if there's one thing the Victorians have taught us, it's that the road to enlightenment is paved with both good intentions and a fair amount of opium.